Buongiorno a tutti, good morning everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce you to the second day and final day of our international conference, Migrantheatre Migration Perspectives in Europe. Yesterday we have quite an intense day, starting all day long here. We had the chance to discuss ongoing perspective in the current days, in the present days, about cultural mobility and theatrical identities over Europe and the connection between migrations and theatrical production and theatrical reception in the present days. Today we will be discussing the recent past and how migrations in the past influenced and still influence theatrical production in different areas of Europe. So it is my pleasure to leave the floor to Emanuele Regi, who will be chairing this session, and I'm thankful to Emanuele, who helped me in the organization of the conference. So please, Emanuele.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to chair this interesting session about the issue of migrant theater in the 19th century in particular. And I entitled Nations, Migrations and Heritage. I'm going to present the first speaker that we have today, Federica Pedriali. Federica Pedriali is a professor of literary meta-theory and modern Italian study and head of Italian at the University of Edinburgh and research affiliate at the Edinburgh Theatre Institute. Her research intersects biopolitics, cognitive narratology, continental philosophy, decolonial studies, migration and diaspora studies, the environmental humanities, performance studies, and political theory. Her most recent work combines a decolonial approach to the material world with the study of the processes of change and cultural redesign. Her paper today is entitled The Lesser Players on the Missing Migrant Italy Theatre in Scotland. You have more or less 25 minutes, please.
Forgot that one. I think it's on. Yes, thank you, Emanuele. Thank you, Matteo, for the wonderful day yesterday. And I must say, it's a hard act to follow. And I'll start again from yesterday, just to remind ourselves that basically you introduced us by saying that migration feeds theater and theater reads migration. This is a very unequal relationship. And I want to stress this as part of this presentation that will touch, in the second part, it will touch Italian migration to Scotland and to the UK more generally. But to begin with, I want also to connect to some of the ideas that were discussed yesterday in order to sort of, tune myself into the kind of conversations that we did make yesterday about the present. This migration feeding theatre and theatre reading migration, as I said, it's an unequal, asymmetrical relationship. And I immediately jumped at the opportunity of thinking theoretically yesterday when Giulia Allegrini was presenting to us her reflections as a sociologist, her reflections on what the social construct is around theatre. And in many ways, I really welcomed when she quoted Rancière on the allocation or partification or separation of the perceptible, the sensible, what we can call also in another translation of the same text, French text, as something that creates regimes of visibility. And the theatre, maybe luckily for it or unluckily for it, becomes a very compromised tool. And yesterday, Sofia Nacco, at some point, she said in her driving presentation that basically theatre is an imperfect tool. And imperfect as it is, it establishes this clear partition, and we've always tried to abolish that partition, which is recreated, by the way, today almost, because this is an auditorium. Primarily, this is a place of performance. And in a sense, I'm performing here something live, and you are watching my visibility, my regime of visibility, what I've created for you as a presentation. Were it another kind of performance, you would call it theatre. This is not, but at the same time, it sort of reminds us of what happens. I am in a regime of visibility where you are instead in a kind of semi-penumbral state, and you're observing vulnerability, message, etc. I'm driving something like yesterday, all the speakers or all of the performers were driving their passion, communicating it to us. At the same time, they present themselves in a state of vulnerability, and the audience is this composite aggregate that actually responds in very individual, separate, idiosyncratic ways, understanding, misunderstanding, voluntarily, unconsciously. All the biases in the world are active in that place out there, which is, as I say, slightly penumbral here and in darkness in some other places. This is theory rendered maybe as part of a conversation or conversational presentation that I'm making today. And so in this regime of visibility, yesterday I had to ask myself what kind of audience member I was when it was my turn to be audience member and when we went into the Narcissus. And in a way, the title of that session, if it was a session, it was a performance as well as a session, it invited us to feel inside the whole, inside basically the Narcissus, the ship, and everything that happens around the recreation of that text by Conrad through the work of the performers, students, Fiorida, and so on and so forth, all of those, Sarah, the wonderful illustrator that gave us a sense or a way of making sense of, a literary text transposed into the present. How did I participate? I don't know how you participated, but I know how I did. I'm a knowledge worker. I could say other things about myself, but as an educator, as a teacher, as an academic, I was there in a sense to observe the mechanics of theater, of performance, and I did participate. I enjoyed it tremendously. At the same time, was I into the play? Were you controlling? I'm talking now to obviously those who staged the performance. Were they in some ways controlling my response? Were they in touch with my response? I doubt it. I was there as you were, in many ways participating fully, but my full participation was nowhere near my full consent. And I was actually, taking my notes about what could have been done differently, how it worked for us, whether, for instance, it felt like a museum experience in which once you have had your audio moment and the loop is complete, you move on. This is participation to what? To the mechanics of performance, of ritual. And the disappearance of rituals is the first, basically, theoretical text that I want to cite in this short presentation. The text is by a Korean philosopher, thinker, Byul-Chung Han, sorry about the pronunciation. And this text, which came out in 2019, is one of the many that Han has produced. And he's a wonderful short book scholar. And in this one in particular, he articulates the opposition or the contrast between a world of work and a world of rituals. And the disappearance of rituals means the disability of the mobility between the two states. Humans gather between this basically oscillation, this binary oscillation between going towards a work kind of domain, maybe the oikos that we mentioned yesterday, a domestic space of elaboration of culture, and then the collective one, the gathering that allowed the collective, if you want, ceremonial to take place. I don't entirely agree on the idea that rituals are disappearing, but I entirely agree on the next point that he makes. And yesterday we did talk about racial capital, and in general we should talk about human capital and the extraction of such a thing from our collective elaboration and our private elaborations, which I've hinted at by reporting my participation to yesterday's performance. Basically, the point that Han makes in his book, The Disappearance of Rituals, is as follows. That capital lacks narrative power. It hasn't got a narrative attached to it. It's a mechanism, it's a relation between people, it extracts social energy. I go back to Giulia Allegrini's point. It extracts social energy, whatever the energy. It compacts that energy in a collective response, which is idiosyncratic, however, and very complex to analyze. And then it pounces on this opportunity. Not having a narrative drive, it appropriates any dominant or emerging promising narrative emerging from the collectivity. And this is something I espouse fully when it comes to analyzing my migration. Now, my migration is an old-fashioned one. I'm going to talk about Italian migration, as I said in the beginning, Italian migration to the UK, and in particular to Scotland. It's a specialist Italian migration within the migration to the Anglophone world. It's very different, it was very different to migrate to Scotland and to the UK in general, compared to migrating to the Americas, to the New World, to North America, and to the US. Very, very different, and we should be really careful about not mixing the two opportunities. When I discussed with colleagues from a former project that I'll mention, the wonderful Carlo Pirozzi, for those who know the wonderful Carlo Pirozzi, they know whom I am referring to. When I discussed this with the previous protagonists of this project, among them Carlo Pirozzi, just to mention his name once more, the comments were, very interesting, and I'll filter them and I'll use them as part of the written version of this text. Carlo had one thing to say, which I want to basically launch myself with, and that is, we know the limits of that community, which is quite telling, and I would like to stress the we know them. The we and them, the kind of marked separation. I have lived in Scotland for a very long part of my life by now, over 20 years, and Carlo had lived by then for a long period of time. Neither of us are Italo-Scots. Neither of us have made the Italo-Scots community. We are just, the latest arrivals. And we distinguish ourselves from them. And we have established in our private community, what yesterday was referred to as part of the Migrantheatre work, basically we've established this conversation about we not being them. And the particular, let's say, case study that I was to bring to our attention is exactly arising from that project that now allows Carlo and myself to have this private conversation. The project started exactly 10 years ago. I applied for funding, I got the funding. With Carlo, we started this project, the Italo-Scottish Research Cluster, the aim of which was to do something that had never been done before, and that is to talk to them, to establish a connection between academia. I was the first female professor of Italian at Edinburgh, and as such, I felt that it was not an obligation, but really a conversation that I wanted to have. We know that, numerically speaking, there is a very large Italo-Scottish community in Scotland, of course, and the lack of communication, the lack of engagement was striking, was stunning, was amazing. So we established this initiative, and the objective of which, and that's why we got the grant, was to gather the kind of conversations, interview people, record them, video record them, create an online archive, and use that material to promote and basically commission a piece of theatre, a piece of performance, which finally, the project having started in 2013 officially, finally came to production and basically repeat performances in Scotland and in Italy in 2016. The play is called A Bench on the Road by Laura Pasetti. Laura Pasetti is a trainer and someone who basically grew up in the Piccolo Milano. She herself migrated to Scotland. Like myself, she's not an Italo-Scots and has made Scotland her home. It's interesting when on video, in interviews, she gets asked, she says, "Mi chiamo, I'm called, my name is Laura Pasetti," which is already a departure from pronouncing your name Laura Pasetti, which you would do were you trying to integrate yourself from the very first thing that you say about yourself. And she considers herself now, as I say, someone who has fully migrated. Her play starts with this note: we're all migrants. And it goes on from there, and I'll say a few more things about it. But before, I want to introduce the other play that became part of the project indirectly, because it became part of the student productions. And Irene yesterday was referring to both plays, and she both Basically, she referred to the fact that the Italian section or department, as it is at Edinburgh, does run an Italian play, a production by students. Irene is in charge now, and previously it was, of course, Carlo Pirozzi, once again. And at that point, I want to say that in 2019, to celebrate the centenary of Italian studies at Edinburgh, note 2019 means 1919, it means post-World War I. Many of the Italian departments in the UK were created following the First World War, the Great War. And so again, as an act of making peace, of reconnecting, cut off bridges, and so on and so forth, there was that wide adoption, if you want, of a teaching of the language and the culture that had been going on since the Renaissance, by the way, but in forms that were not as institutional or as formalized. So in 2019, to celebrate the centenary, we came up with a second play, and this is my second case study, a play by Anne-Marie Di Mambro. She's second or third, I can't remember now correctly, generation, so she is Italo-Scots. She produced this play in 1990, so very many years ago, and the 25th anniversary of this play, which became quite well known in Scotland and in the UK, was celebrated with a number of events around Scotland. And in 2019, we used it as a way to celebrate our centenary. So again, a gesture of restitution, of giving back something to a community that had not been in any form of conversation with ourselves. Now, this particular play, together with A Bench on the Road by Laura Pasetti, make a nice match. They touch the very same story, even though the spread, the temporal spread that they cover is different. The approach in technical terms is very different, but at the center of this, there is a trauma. Finally, even this community has got its trauma. And again, yesterday, Irene touched upon, maybe too quickly on this, because the trauma that the Italian community face, having integrated, in a sense, quite well, and having integrated quite quickly, they came as destitutes, as people with no baggage, in the sense literally no baggage, often having walked on foot to the Channel, and then having crossed the English Channel and having walked on to their final destinations. Some others having left, say, Genova, thinking they were going on a ship to New York, and found themselves landing in Liverpool. All of these things, have happened to this community, profoundly illiterate, profoundly also gendered, because very many were women or children, also minors, traveling on their own, joining the rest of the family, uncles, brothers, and so on, that had moved beforehand. Now, the trauma at the center of this story, which could be a kind of, common, not particularly, let's say, action-based kind of migration, finds its trauma in the 1930s, of course, with the political developments in Europe of a variety of despotical governments. We don't need to name them. But in 1940, Italy declares war on Britain. And at that point, Churchill comes out with this expression, which is in every single book on this topic: collar the lot, grab them and obviously, intern them. And thousands of Italian men, citizens, and not military personnel were basically arrested and started to be removed. Very many ended up on ships that crossed the Atlantic or other seas and ended up in Australia, in internment camps, in Canada, North America, and so on and so forth. One particular ship, the Arandora Star, in July 1940 left Liverpool, which was also a destination of so many migrant ships arriving. And at that point, it was torpedoed by the Germans, which is an ironic, if you want, form of injustice or justice. The point is that this was a cruise ship. It was basically a steamship traveling for, let's say, passenger travel in those years, but it had been turned into a prison. And these guys, who were citizens and not prisoners of war, sank with the ship, not being able even to try to escape, because basically the cabins were cells and their windows were, with barbed wire and so on and so forth. Now, when you talk to the community today, and this is an important point that I want to reach in my conclusion, when you talk to the community today, everyone, and that's maybe extraordinary and nearly impossible, maybe there is this passing on of a trauma that is not really your own. Obviously, we're talking about people that have survived, obviously, they were not there at that time, but their great-grandparents, their great-grandparents, their great-great-uncles, and so on and so forth, there is always a connection to the Arandora star. In 2010, in the anniversary of the event, in the Cathedral of Glasgow Cathedral, a memorial site was inaugurated with all the paraphernalia of inaugurations. The beauty of it is that it represents or tries to symbolize a concentration camp in the shape of a ship. It is an open-air space where the standing stones are not stones, but pillars of steel with poetry basically imprinted on it. And when it rains, it looks like it's so shiny, that surface, that when it rains, it looks like tears. And that is the only memorial that you find. And it's very touching presence in Glasgow. Going back to the plays, however, because this is the problem that I want to put to you. There is a problem with these both performances. With the Mambro performance, Dimambro is a screenwriter and has a reputation of her own, but she reached acclaim through Tully's Blood. Now, yesterday I problematized that title. What I don't think I managed to put through is that this is a profoundly racist title, but it's not perceived as such. Neither, and here I'm making a mistake in English, but it doesn't matter, neither by the playwright herself, because she doesn't problematize it in the play, nor in the audience. And when I say the audience is by now generations of users that have used this text as part of their education, because this has become part of the national curriculum in Scotland, believe it or not, for some reason. And I'll say more about the content, and it will strike you as, why did they pick this text? And this text, having become National 5 English prescribed text, it continues to be read by people in their teens in Scotland as part of their exam taking. There is a lot of pedagogical material that, of course, has been written around this play. And again, like the playwright, who is very difficult to get, by the way, I only met her once when we were producing the play in 2019. But then, since then, I tried to reach out right now to have, more updates on what she thinks about the play. I don't think she's comfortable about talking about it. Again, is surprising. And it's part of the thesis that I'm building up on this migration and the few representatives from within the community that have, in a sense, dared speak their story. There is a missing story here, and this is why I've talked, about the missing Italian migrant theatre in Scotland and in the UK. Are we nearly reaching there? Yes. So moving on, Dimambro's play is interesting because, in a sense, it puts to us, instead of putting to us the story of a community, an Italian community within a community, Glasgow in particular, the working class in Glasgow, a particular destitute working class, by the way, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, which is the setting of the play, which touches upon the Arandora Star and all the rest. What is surprising in that play is that the treatment of the story is entirely domestic. And so we go back to a repertoire of Italianness, to which Irene yesterday hinted, where basically the story to tell is about this family-based society, which, looked at from the sociologist perspective of someone like Edward Banfield, who in the 1950s spent a year down south with his wife, who happened to be Italian. So he had an interpreter there, and spent that year in a small community down south in Italy to study a village, the life of a village, and came out with a book in 1958, The Moral or Amoral Background. Sorry, I'm missing now the title. The Amoral Basis of a Backward Society. It's a very strong title and a very strong book. And it is also the time when experimental photographers were flocking down south to the village of Scanno to take photographs of what? Of Italian women in their heavy traditional clothing. This is also the moment when Italy was trying to be modern for once, Italian design, Milan, the powerhouse of a new economy, and so on and so forth. And yet the international market was still using for what? And here it's where I draw some conclusions, rushed as they are, and entirely to be developed later on in the full version of the text. The migrant community in Scotland has not produced its theatre. It has not produced its narrative. It has not produced its testimony. In 2013, as part of the project that I described to you, we managed to organize a public event, a public debate in the Scottish Parliament. And as part of that debate, we invited all of those we could reach out. Obviously, there was an audience limit because the auditorium there was, again, numbered, so there were only as many seats. But those who came basically had the Restitution Act. We were emotional. That was not a piece of theatre, but maybe it was a piece of live performance. It had never happened before. This community has been silenced by war, by political events, but also by the nature of their migration. It was a migration of cultured people, but also it was a migration from Italy, a country, and here I try to conclude, a country that has served to the, let's say, purposes of Europe to make an Italy in which they recognized their origin. The people of Italy has served that purpose for so long, so much so, that we cannot be modern. And what we have performed in our streets in Rome, in Italy, in Venice, where Ruskin, Goethe, Freud, Madame de Staël, all of them came and cast their judgments on the people of Italy as they peopled their ideal city. As this was happening, an idea of performing our identity within the straits of our, let's say, declined condition established itself. And the stereotypes are active at all levels on basically domestic soil. When it came to migrating, culture was left behind. Of course, it had never been part of the legacy of some of these people, and they didn't pick it in the new country because the kind of performance that they made on the high streets of Scotland was exactly, once again, to be colorful, to be useful, service providers, and that was as far as it went. When the war broke out, they became enemy aliens overnight. And it was, in a sense, the trauma is the realization of how skin deep is integration. And this is an important point. But the nature of the performance hasn't changed since. And when it comes to the fewer and rare between pieces of theater that we do have, like A Bench on the Road or Tully's Blood, actually what the community fails to bring to performance is the sense of the real contribution that we have made to the making of Europe, which has made Italy. The made in Italy is a made in Europe, and it's basically stating over and over again that the society that is hosting us is actually expecting of us that we reinforce their superiority and reaffirm our subalternity. So it is potentially a decolonizing matter. And this is where I stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Federica. I really want to thank you for linked these two parts of the conference, what we saw yesterday and your intervention, because I think that what we did yesterday is actively part of our work. And now you said a lot about memory. Yes. And memory calls us Diego Santos Sanchez.
Yes.
Yes.
Here it comes.
Because thank you, Diego. Yeah. As we said yesterday, the fourth panel will host both Piotr Horbatowski and Silvia Garzarella, because we had a problem with Katarzyna Wozniak-Szukur that she couldn't come, and for personal issues. So I remember to the audience that the fourth session will host Piotr Horbatowski and Silvia Garzarella. After this communication, I'm going to present the second speaker that we have today, Diego Santos Sanchez. Diego Santos Sanchez is associate professor at Universidad Complutense de Madrid, where he teaches on 20th and 21st centuries Spanish literature and theater. His PhD on avant-garde playwright Fernando Arrabal was co-supervised at the University of Alcalá, Madrid, and Harvard. He subsequently held academic position at the Durham University, Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, and Humboldt University zu Berlin. His research revolves around the impact of the Franco regime upon theater, paying special attention to censorship and exile. He also serves as academic secretary of CHALIA, Revista de Estudios Teatrales, and ITEM, Instituto de Teatro de Madrid, both at Universidad Complutense. Diego, you have 25 minutes, and please.
Well, thank you, Emanuele, and thank you, Matteo, for organizing this wonderful conference. Buongiorno a tutti e a tutte. One of the main objectives of my talk today was to serve as a reverse to my colleague from Complutense, who couldn't make it finally to Bologna. His talk was devoted to the depiction of Spain's, or rather Madrid's, stages as a cosmopolitan venue welcoming theater from the Hispanic world. Though this may well be the case nowadays, a diachronic look into our not that remote past reveals Spanish theater's cosmopolitanism was once rounded upon exportation rather than upon importation. This exportation having, of course, been forced. The 1939 Republican exile and its theater are a contentious subject of study, and I will make the core of my presentation out of that. I will work on theatrical terms and therefore present a brief account of this exile as a three-act tragedy. On the second part of my talk, I will shift the focus on how poorly this legacy has been integrated into Spanish theatrical canon, partially thanks to how exile challenges assumptions of the nation in a nation-driven theater historiography. Now let's narrate the tragedy. I shall start the first act with a very general and short presentation on the grounds of exile. Spain had traditionally concentrated its gaze on the Americas, but the loss of its last colonies in 1898 ruined its previous grandeur. It was no longer an empire, nor had it fully integrated within the European context. The first third of the 20th century, also coined as Silver Age, put at last remedy to the situation, as it had Spanish culture inexorably headed into modernity. A fertile soil for modernism, as well as, or rather mostly for the avant-garde, resulted in outcomes you all may well know: Buñuel's Ancien Andalou, Picasso's or Dali's paintings, and as we enter the theatrical domain, Valle-Inclán's and Lorca's theater, in line with the most radical aesthetic and ideological developments across European stages. These innovations stem from before 1931, but were particularly cherished by that year's Second Republic, whose main goal was to render Spain a modern democracy in social, political, economic, educational, and cultural terms. However, traditional and fascist sectors of Spanish society saw a threat in this and pulled together in the 1936 coup, which evolved into a 3-year-long civil war, and whose outcome is the Franco regime. Beyond the economic, social, and political implications of the 40-year-long dictatorship, it is necessary to understand the ways in which this regime impacted the literary and theatrical fields, which I have coined as anomalous elsewhere. This anomaly is rooted upon a series of handicaps. First, the Silver Age was put to a violent halt, and avant-garde languages became anathema, quite similarly as had happened with Entartete Kunst in Germany, for it was deemed alien. In addition, non-Castilian cultures, especially Catalan one, which had flourished in the previous decades, were initially banned. Further, foreign literatures and theater were especially monitored, so Spain got relatively isolated from aesthetic developments. On top of that, censorship became mandatory, fostering bureaucratization, arbitrariness, favoritism, opportunism, and of course, self-censorship. However, the most complex and radical of these handicaps is the segregation of Spanish culture in two fields, detached both geographically and mostly ideologically, that in Spain and that in exile. The extreme nationalistic agenda of the Franco regime imposed one dogma: fled Republicans associated to communism, Jewry, and Masonry had ruined Spain and were thus considered non-Spanish. Further, they were usually referred to as la anti-España. This allowed for a very easy understanding of culture within the borders as Spanish culture, disdaining that produced beyond the borders by authors no longer considered Spaniards. Now let's move on to the body or middle of the tragedy. The outcome of the Civil War determined a large contingent of theater practitioners, including playwrights, actors and actresses, directors, stage designers, and figurine makers, fled Franco Spain looking for survival, for they had mostly positioned themselves against the 1936 coup, as well as for professional opportunities elsewhere. France having been the first option for geographical reasons, most of the exiles further continued their exodus onto Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America. Buenos Aires and Mexico City became then the theatrical hubs of Spanish culture. The most immediate consequence was the stages of Madrid and Barcelona, to name but the largest cities, were deprived of their flourishing Silver Age theater and filled with vacuous commercial theater stemming from 19th century models. Theatrical renewal had been thus put to a violent halt. I'm going to skip this part. I was going to briefly give an account of the three main countries where exile settled, that is France, Argentina, and Mexico, but I think I'll move forward to the most interesting bit. It has been pointed out that exile theater, despite its heterogeneity, can be described as incarnating a series of topics, mostly two of them. Firstly, it is very much conceived as testimony of the present. It depicts the not to be forgotten Republican experience, delves into the rise of fascism in Europe, and pins the causes of the civil war in Spain, denounces Francoism as well as Nazism, and reflects on the Cold War. Secondly, it also poeticizes the so-called lost Spain, building a mythic country that operates mostly as shelter, drawing from childhood memories. Generally speaking, exile drama keeps alive the flame of modernity, well extinguished in Spain. Authors took that responsibility as a mandate, so as to light that flame again in Spain once they could return to the homeland. But of course, Playwright was not but a piece of exile theater. Troops also explored the tradition, reinterpreting Golden Age theater as well as dissident voices, a recently assassinated Lorca being taken as one more exile. Directors and actresses, mostly actresses, contributed to the renewal of staging and acting in Latin America thanks to their practice and mostly teaching. Some authors also explored commercial theater and became very popular. Let us move now on the denouement of this tragedy. The destinies of these theater people vary substantially. Overall, practitioners enjoyed different degrees of success in exile, while dramatists were kept rather off the stages, with some exceptions, of their welcoming countries. All of them, though, have something in common: their full absence and lack of recognition in Franco's Spain. The regime perpetrated a blockade to exile theater, for it was not considered Spanish. Censorship operated freely and fiercely. Texts were banned and therefore not available, so connection to readers and potential performers and critics was interrupted. The regime needed to erase the Republican tradition, so the bourgeois in anti-Franco opposition couldn't claim it. While the first half of the Franco regime had a scarce number of censorship requests for exile plays, the last 2 decades, 60s and 70s, saw this number increase, but mostly in performances by amateur and experimental theater, not quite by professional companies. This theater found refuge rather off the stages in the journal Primer Acto, first act would be the translation, which had traditionally put the focus on dissident theater, but from the mid-60s paid special attention to exile theater, both publishing plays and offering scholarship on them to a Spanish readership, which gained knowledge of a Spanish theater outside of Spanish borders. We have to wait until the transition to democracy to see the first professional and high-standard premieres of exile plays in Spain. The most significant one may be that of El Adefesio, a 1944 text by Rafael Alberti, premiered in Buenos Aires. Alberti, icon of the Silver Age, of the Spanish Communist Party, and of the Republican exile all at a time, was particularly appropriated to undertake this so-called Operación Rescate, something I would translate as rescue operation, something long sought for by the Spanish intelligentsia. The play was premiered in 1976. The cast included exile actress Maria Casares. The show featured a breast-naked actress, and the absence of the author, Alberti, who had refused to come to Spain until the Communist Party was legalized, imbued the event with some sort of magic. Needless to say, the show was read politically rather than aesthetically. Alberti was back in 1977 as deputy of the recently legalized Communist Party in the first democratically elected parliament in 40 years. However, further shows of his dramaturgy couldn't fulfill the high expectations created in society. Emblematic premieres took place, but they were isolated and did not provide a real recovery of exile theatre. Moving forward into democracy, it is worth mentioning a premiere of a text by Max Aub, and arguably the icon of exile theatre. Despite his cosmopolitan roots, which come from all over Europe, Aub, who was 11 when his family moved to Valencia, decided to use Spanish as his literary language. His theatre, as well as his narrative, can be read as a chronicle of the European fight against fascism. His Jewish descent and his condition of defeated Republican take in his place various forms of the persecuted. In this sense, one of his most representative plays is San Juan, written in 1943, published in Mexico in that same year, and then in 1964 in the Spanish journal Primer Acto, which I just mentioned. I'm gonna refer to ships again, which is a very recurrent topic in this conference. San Juan is the name of a cargo ship, hosting a heterogeneous group of Jews fleeing pogroms. The ship roams hopelessly, as the captain cannot get license to dock in any Mediterranean harbor. Jews of all sorts, rich and poor, secular and religious, try to get their own salvation individually, what leads them to a collective failure as the ship sinks. Aub denounces with this play that collective problems need collective solution. Being fascism the root of all collective problems in the day, it can only be defeated undertaking a collective fight. Aub's theater is far from being conventional, which determined his struggle to have it perform in the professional scene in Mexico. He usually lamented being a failed author condemned to the page. Trying to put a remedy to this condemnation, the Regional Theatre of Valencia and the Dramatic National Center of Spain premiered the play in 1998. The director argued Aub was valid as long as there were race, religion, or sex-related conflicts in the world. The ship was conceived as a prison, as a labyrinth, as Noah's Ark, and as a metaphor of the world. As it had happened with Alberti's play, it awoke great interest in its Madrid, Valencia, and Lisbon tour, and was a big success, subject to a politicizing reading. However, it didn't serve as catalyst for a true recovery of Aub's theater, and was rather a flash in the pan. Sorry. Franco's censorship had acted as a blockade against exile theater. The transition to democracy was considered a one-of-a-kind moment to recover this corpus, but isolated premieres didn't trigger a whole recovery. At the end of the day, the transition to democracy was modeled on the desire to move forward and forget the past. Avoiding the traumatic past made the gap between the writing and the eventual premiere of plays even broader, allowing critic Manuel Aznar to speak about the stage drama of exile dramatic literature, a dramatic literature that never got to the stages. El Adefesio got to Spanish stages 33 years after its conception. San Juan took 55 years to make that trip. These two plays are, unfortunately, examples of those who made it. Most of them, though, still await to be performed in Spain. A theater not reaching the stages and a ship sinking in the Mediterranean are both in their tragic ends. I will now move on to the second part of my presentation, in which I shall argue that this tragic end needs to be reversed and the situation needs to be redressed. We cannot go back to the past and deliver exile theater to the Spaniards of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. But we can still deliver it to Spaniards of the 21st century. Exile critic Maripaz Valibrea argues that contemporary Spain is persistently haunted by the memory of Republican exile, which is both marginal and central to Spanish culture. It stays in the margins, for it has not been fully integrated into the narratives of the nation, but is at the same time central, for its absence remains an unresolved and timely problem. Freud explains that trauma can be dealt with in two manners. Mourning allows us to process and overcome, allowing us to look into the future, while melancholia gets us stuck in the trauma, not letting us close the past nor move on into the future. the unveiled legacy of exile theater acts as a haunting ghost that prevents Spanish society from abandoning melancholia. Until this corpus, or at least a representative part of it, is duly published and staged, the theater 20th century Spain will remain incomplete, thus stuck in melancholia. The complete narrative of that theater still needs to be written. Memory studies provide solid arguments to try and redress this situation. This discipline deals with the past following present interests. To put it in other terms, it recalls from the past that which is relevant for us now. It uses the past as a means to build the present. Collective memory in Spain suffers from Franco's invention of tradition, to use Hobsbawm's term, whose narrative, Franco's narrative, remained after his own life, and some of whose elements still endure. By forging a dogmatic orthodoxy and leaving aside all forms of heterodoxy, official narratives of the time blockaded exile theater. Detached from its natural audiences, this theater got lost from the narrative of the nation. Not being present in histories of theater, theater specialists were not aware of the existence of such theater and in turn couldn't access plays, make them available for audiences on stage, research them, incorporate them into the canon. 21st century's growing interest into the past has determined exile has become a very attractive subject matter for creators. So second and especially third generation authors give it room in their creations. However, these manifestations of post-memory, to use Hirsch's term, prove insufficient while the ghost of the protagonists of exile still haunt contemporary Spain. Collective memory in Spain needs to articulate this ghost duly so they no longer haunt the house. It has been pointed out that we cannot understand Spanish theater today without the legacy of many exiled practitioners whose legacy is pivotal to understand theatrical practice today. In terms of dramatic literature, exile theater provides first-hand testimonies of war and exodus, as well as censorship-free accounts of those collective traumas. Without all this, the polyhedron of theater of the Franco era remains incomplete. In terms of Pierre Nora, this theater may serve as lieu de mémoire for Spanish democratic legacy, be it ephemeral if or when performed as a ceremony of the nation, or persistent when published and incorporated into the archive. Assuming this is a mandate for the sake of a sound collective, cultural, and theatrical memory, we need to understand first the necessity of putting this corpus in a sort of virtuous circle. In order for stage directors to know plays, they need to be made available in series editions. To get to that point, researchers need to know about this theater, and it seems obvious they will not get to know it properly if it is not included in the official narratives of theater, that is, in histories of theater. In her trying to understand how theater histories work, Susan Bennett linked such texts with the archive, subject to a complex definition. The archive would be a place keeping fragments of the past that becomes a key source for the nation, as it is taken as the basis for forging the national tradition. Indeed, the very notion of the nation still guides our understanding of literary, artistic, cultural, and, as is our case here, theater traditions. The national approach of histories of theater is usually taken as an epistemological a priori. However, rendering the exile apprehensible in such narratives has proved problematic, for exile destabilizes the very narrative of the nation. Being exile theater made by a corpus of plays written beyond the boundaries of the nation and by a series of authors denied its condition of Spaniards, the Franco regime had it easy to exclude that theater from the official discourse. Isolated mentions were made by some theater historians of the time, which are but rare exceptions in the broader picture. Nowadays, the collective demand of looking back into the past determines no serious history of theater can elude inscribing exile in their narratives, as it is assumed it makes part of the history of Spanish theater under Franco as much as that developed in Spanish soil. This consensus reveals Spain is no longer conceived as a merely physical or geographical place of enunciation for theater, but rather as one of political nature. Being the dictatorship the radical condition for the existence of exile, this regime becomes the place of enunciation for both those suffering censorship in Spain and for those forced out into exile. The inscription of exile into the historical narrative of Spanish theater does not go, however, without epistemological challenges. Historians have two options to articulate their accounts. The first one consists in shaping individual accounts, as happened in the first instances. Histories of theater were made in Spain without accounting the exile, and exile also forged its own narrative. This approach is useful to give account of how these two theaters are subject to dramatically different conditions. While the first one is product of cultural isolation and censorship, the second one grows in contact with other traditions and does not know the restrictions of censorship. While the first one can reach their natural audiences, the second one cannot do it. While the first one sees time as a linear progress, the second one is rather placed at a standstill. While the first one depicts sorrow, the second one puts its efforts in shaping memory. Writing to narratives is dispositive inasmuch as it sheds light into the specificities of each corpus, but entails also various problems. There seems to be one real national discourse, while the second one serves as a subsidiary line to the first. Back in the Franco days, each of the groups claimed to represent Spanish theater, disdaining the other. Reproducing this dichotomy in current historiographical practice reveals counterproductive, for both contribute to the making up of Spanish theater of the Franco era. Thus, there seems to be necessity for some sort of convergence. The second option is a single narrative in which both theaters coexist. This is, by the way, what new literary and theater histories propose. Again, this does not go without epistemological problems. The first one is a domestication of exile into the narratives of the nation, understood as the Franco nation. That means the smaller bit is modified to fit into the larger bit. Historiographical models, categories, and even chronologies of the Franco regime, which are totally alien to exile, for it is subject to other influences and phenomena, are still applied to exile theater to make it fit into the narrative. How is it then possible to make such integration without attenuating exile's specificity? There is a second risk in merging the two narratives. National theater may be understood as a hero subject to a teleological model by virtue of which all conflicts are finally overcome and a satisfactory end is reached. That is, a split national tradition evolves towards modernity, which implies reunification in democracy. Exile scholar Balibrea, which I just quoted, is especially critic to this approach. She argues that histories of the Franco era have traditionally understood culture as a movement of growing anti-Francoism towards modernity in Spain. Being exiled radically anti-Francoist as well, it is though enunciated from a different temporality, that of pathologic melancholia, which renders most of the corpus useless for a shared vision of Spain moving relentlessly towards the future. This understanding has allowed for the recovery of but a few of playwrights, and only inasmuch as they didn't pose a threat to the liberal project of Spanish democracy. The outcome is a partial recovery of exile theater, and on top of this, a depoliticizing reading of that limited chunk. These problems in historically addressing corpuses, such as the Republican exile theater, suggest questioning the notion of the nation, or farther, even going beyond it. While overcoming a romantic understanding of the nation, which links soil, people, and guys, proves insufficient, it may be necessary to adopt an anti-nationalist national perspective that confronts us with our ideas of alterity. Linking exile theater with the Latin American traditions could be a different option. Thus, the theater developed by Spaniards in Argentina become Argentine theater. Going beyond the national would nicely fit in blooming transnational approaches such as comparatism, postcolonialism, transatlantic studies, area studies broadly, not to speak about further critical paradigms such as cultural studies. Exile would then become a golden opportunity to shape a cultural vision alternative to nationalism and nation-driven histories of culture. The problem then of how to narrate exile theater remains unresolved, and I'm afraid I've come to Bologna to deliver more questions than answers. I would therefore very much appreciate any suggestions, hints, or even complaints on this. Many thanks. Grazie mille.
Thank you, Diego. Perfect timing, I would say. I kindly ask Federica Pedriali to come here to open the discussion. Before opening the discussion, I want to underline 3 terms that I think are quite fundamental for both this presentation to understand the methodology they used and to open the debate also about this. The terms are memory, trauma, and archive. I think 3 important terms that perfect fit in your both of your presentation, perfect links.
Do you want us to get going?
No,
Please do. No. Well, I would like to recover some of the time that I did not manage to fit in, but
In terms of time,
yeah. We've got plenty of time, which is great, Diego. So let's enjoy this wonderful moment. We have got time, unlike everyone else in the world.
Exactly.
We have got time, and we'll use it. So about, yes, memory, trauma, and archive.
And if I may, I would add a 4th concept, which is recovery.
Recovery, yes.
Yeah.
So the point I was starting from, if I may, briefly, was that societies are extremely reproductive. And yesterday we were sort of concentrating on the idea of process, but the process is still that of ultimate social reproduction. So these societies that are extremely reproductive find in the theater a moment in which the oikos, as we call it yesterday, domestic domain, which is in the Agamben sense, totally apolitical, by the way. It's not the polis, it's the opposite. It's the whole, ibuki, in the political fabric. But let's assume that oikos can mean, societies in the wider sense. And it performs itself in this space. Now, if on the oikos stage you place the immigrant, then you have that kind of maintenance of conflict that Giulia Allegrini was trying to invite us to think about. How do we articulate conflict at that point? Given that, yes, there is always a stranger on our stage, and somehow theater has got to do with that disruption. At the same time, as she hinted, it's an operation that invites maintenance, ultimately. You have your moment, let's call it catharsis, within this volume of air and performance. At the same time, as soon as you've finished, as Virginia Woolf would remind us in the text between the acts, as soon as the audience leaves the pantomime, which is the object of that text, ultimately it's dispersed. This moment of cathartical coming together around an understanding, and society reaggregates around its biases, its workings, maybe marginally transformed, maybe substantially transformed, but still returns to a different state. Now, if the performance, and to go back to my point about Italian migration to Scotland, what kind of social reproduction of the immigrant is allowed on a British stage or on a Scottish stage? And I think that Italians, when I call them excellent service providers, that's what I meant, that on that stage, say in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Findhorn, which is where Laura Pasetti is now performing from, and so on and so forth, so up in Aberdeenshire. Basically, the kind of performance that the Italian community has provided has been nearly zero, so they did not consent to basically becoming creators of that service. And that's interesting. This is a community that, following that event, went into hiding. They basically resigned. They returned their identity. They started hiding. They were no longer called Giovanni, they were called Joe. They were no longer called Riccardo, but Richard. They became something other. The women had been left behind, by the way. I did not mention that. While the men spent their intern time in the Americas, say, in some camp or other, the women and the children and the elderly stayed on in a society that saw them as enemy aliens for 4 or 5 years. And again, that's, that has really shaped the memory of that trauma. It's a lasting one. And so when it finally comes to these two members of this society, Anne-Marie Di Mambro and Italo Scott, and Laura Pasetti, an Italian migrated like myself, and they present this show, you've really got to watch what kind of social reproduction of the immigrant is happening on the stage of the British, if I may say so. So we are, in a sense, hosting something that has got a different host sponsoring our cultural presence there. And yesterday we said that all of this is terribly passé, and it is, because what we have staged, though with a temporal divide of 20-odd years between Anne-Marie Di Mambro and Laura Pasetti, is actually, the temporal divide is there, but nothing has changed because the repertoire is fixed. This domestic Italy, neorealistically presenting itself as an Eduardo kind of play in which we only have our own internal domestic context, food, religion, couples growing up, tensions within the family. So in the end, Anne-Marie Di Mambro, when she talks about the play, when she does talk about the play, she talks about a Renaissance play in which you've got the younger people coming up and having to fool the elderly. I couldn't believe that. There is no reference, really. Despite the title that she picked, Tully's Blood, couldn't be more racist. Because these guys in Scotland, you would go into the ice cream parlor, which is how the Italian community developed business. The business plan was to become caterers, tailors, trimsters, and so on and so forth, but they were providing services. One of them was ice cream selling, and they would come into your shop and ask for, put some Tully's blood on my ice cream. And that means put some Italian blood on my ice cream. And this is profoundly racist. The Italian tolerated this, they tolerated through the wars years, and so on and so forth. When it comes to using it, they don't. And so that's where I suppose they've really internalized a role that we have played, I would say, at least since the Renaissance, which is not that glorious moment ultimately for us, because yes, we had our ruins, but we have played for Europe domestically on Italian soil. We have played the kind of troublesome, but still pseudo-Arcadian people that were peopling the ruins of a country that gave Europe its origins, and that's what I'm talking about ultimately. So in going away from Italy, these people took away their subalternity with them, and they were ready to provide the same servicing or services of an Italy that will never be modern. And that's the problem. Italy is not allowed within the European context to be model. And I've taken another 10 minutes, which I did not deliver before. So I've I've completed my talk. Apologies for it, but it's really burning inside. And look, Tully's blood on the little paper that I did have. There is red ink on this.
I really thank you for your speech, because it was really interesting. If you want to add something, Diego?
Well, I was listening with full attention and considering or trying to figure out how the differences between our case studies are. And you see how Italian culture is perceived in a different context in the UK. You spoke about subalternity, and I think you ended your talk with decolonizing gaze to that.
Yeah.
And my question now would be what happens when the local is perceived as a xenos in the oikos, like Spaniards itself being stripped of their Spanish identity in the Franco regime? That is, well, I don't know if I would say that's even worse, but that's bad enough already. So yeah, I mean, none of our cases are good.
No, none of our cases are good, but that's another one, because one thing that one can add on the Italian scene is also, and that's something that, again, I wanted to hint to, is that the elites in Italy, and by that you can mean a liberal Italy at the time of liberal Italy, and then what follows, in a sense, have always sacrificed the oikos, I mean the local people, the natives, as it happened on the domestic soil. And they've sacrificed it in a number of conversations with the rest of Europe. At the practical level, for instance, in World War I, there was greater affinity between the, let's say, the higher hierarchies of the armies. They were all related. The generals were talking to each other on, let's say, confidential terms, and they had no confidence in their people when it came to the Italian soldiers. So in a sense, that population that left in such great numbers between the 1880s and the 1920s, we're talking about millions of Italians that left Italy. Well, in a sense that they'd already been left behind or sacrificed and gone into a kind of, domestic exile within, because they were never culturally speaking, but even societally speaking, they were never in the aims of the governing classes. And they remained profoundly illiterate, even though they became literate at some point in the earlier part of the 20th century. That's another important one, how this problem is played out on the home soil. And then it is, in the case of Italy, exported to the communities that Italy populated outside of Italy. But those are a further reproduction of an Italian model. But the Italian model is also a product of a European input, an investment into Italy. And especially, I like to say that Great Britain, sorry for taking the focus away again to Great Britain, but Britain being so insular, as Brexit has proved amply, but Britain being so insular has meddled with the affairs of the Med in the last 500 years, creating expectations about any and each of us. And Italy, in its Anglophile attitudes towards Britain, is ready to basically accept any kind of discourse that comes, maybe less now, but any kind of discourse, especially scholarly discourse, that comes the way, of Italy. So Italian historiography is written by British scholars. And when they say that the Italian Risorgimento is fortuitous, I worry about, their influence, our take on our own history. So basically, Italy is made in Italy. The made in Italy is a made in Europe, but it's made in Italy, and then it's exported through migration. But it's an asymmetrical flow, very asymmetrical, because people were coming to Italy to gaze it and to form their asymmetrical gaze. These are inferiors. These are others. Ruskin, in describing the lanes, the alleyways in Venice, describes them as these people peopling their own city. They are criminals. They are wriggling like, sub-creatures. You really fear them because they're spoiling the back cloth. And the back cloth is because this was a theater for Europe. You came to Italy to see also the degradation of the people. And all of this is part and parcel of not just an inferiority complex, but of a fixed repertoire in the theatrical sense. Yeah. And so maybe these Italians refuse to be part of this display on a British stage. And in a sense, I respect it. They'll give me an honorary citizenship. I'll get the keys of Edinburgh, finally. And now I promise I shut up.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Federica. I'd like to open the debate. So if there are any questions.
Thank you both, Diego and Federica, for your amazing presentations that allow us to reason more and more about how present day's production is strictly intertwined with our recent past, and not so the most recent one, I guess. Because to the terms, I would add also removal as an important term, because removal is key, in my opinion, because it comes out from Federica's discourse and also from Diego. This is something we have in common. When we, the assets of the standard bearer of civilization, as we were depicted, we depict ourselves, we have depicted ourselves for such a long time in the institutional narratives. When we, the standard bearer of civilization in South America, for instance, are the migrants ourselves, the institutional narratives tend to forget and to remove that part of the past, because it's a construction, it's fictional, it's completely fictional. For instance, I studied a lot on, I started my work on cultural diplomacy and the role and importance of what stands behind the institutional narratives of the Italian cultural policies towards South America, for instance. And when you read those reports, I had the chance to the Complutense 1 month ago to introduce some of these discoveries, archival findings. When you read the descriptions, diplomatics, not the Italian Cultural Institute, which is the institutional and what comes out to the general audience to create the imaginary of Italianness. But when you read those reports, those diplomatic reports, and those ambassadors describing the real situation of Italy abroad, it conflicts heavily with the institutional narrative. For instance, on one hand, we have Mussolini, who was not only the prime minister, but also the minister of foreign affairs in the early 1920s. He wanted to civilize Latin America, and that is the word he used, and bring the Latin stock to the next level by bringing to them the Italian culture, the Renaissance, and Latin history, Roman history to them. And that was the the official purpose. And on the other hand, we have ambassadors and diplomatics living there and exploring the situation and telling them it's not possible because they are illiterate. The Italian living here are illiterate, and what the Italian theater that circulates here is basically illiterate. Yeah. And for instance, there is an ambassador in Brazil, which is key to Italian foreign policy at the time, who said, yes, we have a problem because also the elites, Italian elites living here are illiterate, and I have seen no books, for instance, no books at all in the most richest houses of São Paulo, for instance. That's what he wrote. And how can we be the civilizator if this is the situation? And so that brings, in my opinion, to a removal of the real conditions of Italian theater abroad, of Italian migrants abroad, to create a fictional idea of what Italy is. And my question is particularly addressed to Diego. When you talk about the haunting ghost, I think it's something that can be similar to this aspect, because in Spain, for instance, with the Instituto Cervantes, they are trying to create a narrative of Spanish identity abroad based on nationalism, which, as you correctly address, what is nationalism? How can we introduce exile, Republican exile, to fit into this narrative? It's highly problematic. And the question is particularly fascinating: how should we consider, for instance, Alberti's production? Is it a real Spanish production, or is it considered an Argentine production? And how do in Argentine consider that? Because they are very nationalistic too. So I don't know if you have an idea about that.
Well, Alberti is a very particular case because his production can be also considered Italian. He lived in Rome for a number of years too. So, well, I don't know how it works in Argentina and to which degree they claim him, because his Spanishness was something he also performed quite consciously. He was like the icon of the Communist Party in exile, so he had always a foot in Spain symbolically. And one of the images of the return of the transition to democracy is Alberti, getting off the plane when he comes in 1977 to take his deputy seat. It is difficult, and there were already in the transition, as I slightly mentioned, some initiatives to restore that official culture and make that legacy, Republican exile legacy, belong or tie it into the official culture. But what happened is that it just didn't work, because in that particular moment, people didn't want to go back to the trauma, as trauma was still recent. I guess society needed to reconfigure its narratives and let trauma, repose a bit. So that was not a good timing, apparently. A lot of public money was invested in splurge productions of these authors, or some of these authors, Alberti having been the one. But then the critics received that very positively, but not audiences. Like, audiences' interested has shifted into different things, because Spanish society had shifted into something new. And now there wasn't censorship, so theater could speak about topics that were far more interesting to people, such as adultery, divorce, which became legal, abortion, which became legal, drugs, that were something, popping up in society. With the time, homosexuality, AIDS. So topics had shifted because society had changed, and that was no longer valid. But I think now is a good moment to recover such voices, because second generation, like the sons and daughters of those that experienced civil war, were still under trauma. But then third generations, like the grandsons and granddaughters, are no longer living under trauma and are actually trying to force authorities and the government to undertake some measures. I don't know whether you also had it here in Spain, in Italy, but Franco was removed, like the corpse of Franco was removed from his burial site a couple of years ago, and that was like a whole national thing, because it was a sign of the government, of the state actually, willing to redress the situation, that was an offense. Having Franco buried in this burial site was an offense for many people in Spain. So I guess now it would be a good moment to do it, but still you have to wave that narrative, which is difficult too, because there is also a large part of the society which are very reluctant to that, because for these people, or this sector of society, waving that narrative is a matter of opening wounds. But for the other, it's a necessity of healing wounds. So yeah, it's still tough and contentious, like I said. So like I said, I don't have the answer. I wish I had it. I guess nobody does it. And the society is still very much bisected, which isn't good, I guess.
Thank you, Diego. There are other questions. We have enough time.
Sorry if I feel free to speak freely. So we have, as I said, we have time. This is something that never happens. So we can debate a bit more. No, I'd like to get back to the concept of removal, which is key in my opinion, and how it works effectively also for the audience here. Last night, the show we watched, Sporco Negro, and I say also for the sake of our foreign guests, in the end, they sing a song. I don't know if you noticed that, because it was not translated. This is a song whose title is Maseghe Pensu, which is a song that was written in the 1920s in Italy for the benefit of the Italian migrant community abroad. It's sung in Ligurian dialect, and it became, still nowadays, it is a hymn of the region, Liguria, which is the region where the company is set, Migrantheatre is set. And so they chose to sing that song to remember that we, in the pathetic part of the show, it says we need a pathetic ending for this story. And probably it went too far, it was too much, as they said in the end. And they sing this song to remember to ourselves that we also were part of that history. And when I say that removal worked so effectively here, that some of my colleagues that are Italian didn't know the song. They said, what was that? Because it's in a dialect which differs slightly from Italian. They did not understand the words, and they said, they didn't understand the finale, the ending of the story. And it was perfectly clear to the company itself, and they said, everybody should know this song because it is from our region, because a rather peripheral one, but it has become a hymn of migration. But in the end, even our fellow colleagues who are educated people who know a lot from theater, music, and so on, didn't know anything about that and did not understand the ending. So I think the removal worked effectively also in these terms.
Yeah, in a sense, I would like to to link what Diego was just saying before and what you've just said, repeating the invitation to invest or engage with the idea of removal and the timeliness of, let's say, a rendition through the arts, in this case, the performing arts. There was a window of opportunity, and you really find it difficult in your case study and in mine to place it somewhere. When was the window of opportunity for that particular story to make it to the stage? In some ways, for that Italian migration to Scotland, it is too late, and yet this is the time in which the narratives about migrating, obviously with people and bodies going through the process that are very different from the ones of the Italian migrants of the 1880s onwards, and so on and so forth. But it is the moment in which narrating, as Sophia yesterday was telling us about, the asylum-seeking processes and how the narrative theory and therapies can work towards that rehabilitation of the narrative and so on and so forth. This could be the moment also. At the same time, in its mechanics as a narrative, it is too late because it doesn't speak, again, a modern language, which is what I'm trying to attach to the problem with Italy, that Italy is not allowed to be modern because this serves the purposes of a European identity that needs that awkwardness, that, late coming to modernity and maybe never reaching it. The other one, still playing on the idea of removal, is also, I would say that the word that maybe could be linked to that is shame. And again, in the case of the Italian case, you really have to think of a duality or a number of shames. One is really coming from top down, because the Italian, let's say, I call them elites, but they represent a number of things over time and a number of groupings of people in society. They did express shame for the migration. I mean, a country that had just unified in 1860 completion, 1870, start shedding millions of people. Is that possible? It is possible. That's Italy. Italy in the post-risorgimental period started shedding millions of people. At the moment in which it realized the intellectual, again, the elite dream of becoming one politically, it says at that very moment that having become one market, one nation, one people, it starts shedding people. And they were going through Genova. In a sense, it's our reference, geographical reference of both Matteo and myself. So that song for me was immediately recognizable, Ma se che penso. I'm not Genoese, I was born in Genoa, but still from a migrant background, by the way, but still, immediately it's mine. And Genoa in that story plays an enormous part because it was the part, not just the starting point of the migration of Ligurians, but also of all of these people that were migrating through unified Italy to reach out to other worlds, because they wouldn't stop in Genoa. They would go on. Their travel was taking them really beyond Italy. They were leaving the country behind through a shame of their own. So there is the elitarian shame, the one that looks around, this is the country we now govern? The Piedmontese kind of top-down colonial approach to the rest of the country. But also the people themselves, ashamed of themselves and doing what? Going out there, not to do culture, to set up shops, to prove that they were working members of the new communities, productive members of the new communities, proving that Italians are not dirty, black, and lazy, and just reproducing children and Catholic. All of this, all of a sudden you become hyperactive. As someone who has been described for centuries by Dickens onwards and before him, finally you become the hyper-productive guys that set up shop in the high street. And this is where you're found when war breaks out. Very visible in the regimes of visibility, the high street where there were all those Italian shops. By the way, there were riots in Edinburgh, anti-Italian riots in Edinburgh in 1940s, with looting, with damage, with people wounded, and so on and so forth. So it is a complex rejection of that presence that was so visible. So shame is attached to also, and the cause maybe of removal.
Thank you. Thank you, Federica. There are other questions.
I would have one question, which is probably a bit off the topic, but I wonder whether situation for Italian communities in Argentina is the same as what you describe in the UK, because my perception is that, well, that happens also in New York and Sao Paulo and other cities and places, but I would say that Italian culture is perceived as with a high status in Argentina. So I wonder why distinctions, whether it depends very much on an Anglo-Saxon context or a New World context, or what would be the answer for that?
I love this question. Thank you, Diego. In a sense, I've already hinted when I started off saying that migrating to the New Worlds, migrating to Australia, to North America, to South America, Latin America, whatever we want to call it, is a different matter from migrating within Europe. And within Europe, there is, again, a sharp difference between migrating to, say, France or Spain or Switzerland or, the adjacent neighboring countries and migrating to the UK. It is a particularly tough destination in a subtle, undeclared way. And to this day, it's a difficult integration, even though it did happen very quickly because, again, setting up shop, there were opportunities on the high street and there were very many flourishing businesses. So it was not, in the end, an economic problem that these remain destitutes. No way. They became productive members of a new society. But the difficulty in handling that past that we share within Europe, that domestic colonialism I keep referring to, the fact that the British in particular fueled the Grand Tour. We can call it a European phenomenon, but primarily it was a matter of aristocratic families, their circles, their entourages coming to Italy, spending a very substantial time in Italy. Dickens spent, winters in a Ligurian villa outside of Genoa, and, again, had lots to write. Books upon books were written about these travels because, of course, these were writing opportunities. Once again, is it transformation or exploitation? I think that where we are involved in this phenomena, there are opportunities for making money. Clearly, Dickens did sell his pictures of Italy, and his pictures of Italy contain this journey from the border to down to Rome, the crossing into the papal state. It's amazing to read. And finally, having rejected a lot of what he sees, he comes to the Colosseum and says, finally, I get the legacy of Rome. Well, this is an arena where, people used to be killed, where, people were basically executed as part of public rights of entertainment. Well, this is where Dickens finds the origins of Europe. All of this is so embroiled. And I think that this journey from Britain into Italy is particularly meaningful. They weren't the only ones. And this is what marks our migration to Britain. Because even though not everyone traveled to Italy, but it's part and parcel of the kind of paraphernalia of travel, the souvenirs, the prints, the imaginary Italy that you have in your mind, the coffee table books that teach you how to furnish your house in the Tuscan style and so on and so forth. It's a huge market to this day. But what it basically replicates is the sense that Italy has got to be exported along those channels. Domesticity, pleasure, leisure, uselessness, banality, political irresponsibility, untrustworthiness of the people themselves. In all of this, however, there is enjoyment to be gained. And hence you go, and hence you basically treat the people you host on your stage at home in a certain way. So that performance, and I go back for the one last time to the two plays, is basically confirming that repertoire with such fixity and, I would say, fossilization almost, that it's painful to watch. You only have that family playing out its familial amorality, to go back to that title by the American sociologist Edward Banfield, that basically had only negative things to say in 1958, having lived 1 year down south in Italy. Nothing but negative things to say about the family-based society that he found in that, basically a village, comparing it to basically a similar village of a similar size in Utah, of all places, in the US, and coming to the conclusion that whereas in the US there is a society, which we Europeans think it's not, but anyway, he found that there was a fully functional society in Utah and not down south Italy, because everything was revolving around the family. And what kind of theater do we bring to the British scenes? The family. the backward, the Eduardo kind of family sitting around the table, eating endlessly, producing children, having internal tensions, and so on and so forth. The housewife, the patriarchal domain. Yes. Julia.
Julia, I'll give you the mic. I just wanted to answer Diego's question about Argentina, because he asked about Argentina. I will go quickly. We have time, don't worry. Argentina is particularly interesting for Italian migration because it was the most important destination in South America. In the 1890s, yearly, we literally exported on the ships starting from Genoa, sailing from Genoa, 400,000 people yearly, which means a lot. Yeah. But what happens once they were there? There is also an institutional narrative of the role of Italian people in Argentina, because they had been part until 1911 of a national governmental policy for creating another Italy in South America, in Argentina. So this was part of a governmental design, we might say, in this idea, this glorious idea. And there is a wonderful book by Fernando Jorge Devoto, who wrote the history of migration to Argentina and how they created the nation and the idea of the nation. And Italy's place is rather marginal in a way until the 1910s, which is a late moment, because we basically exporting manpower. Yeah. Manpower to work the land. The real power in the country was the Spanish legacy, and did not cope, not wanting to accept the Italian community, which was huge, as a way to negotiate the difference among them. And this is precisely why, for instance, the Italian company touring there, Argentina became an important market for Italian theater between in 1920s, the early 20s. And when they moved there, what did they stage? They staged opera, of course, and they also staged grotesque. And it is grotesque, which is a popular genre, that became seminal for the Argentine national production. For instance, the company of José Podestá, which creates the figure of Cocoliche, who becomes the language, this pastiche of Spanish, Castilian, and Italian dialects, which still today becomes the basis of Lunfardo. The early Lunfardo is Cocoliche. Cocoliche is a character of a comedy of the Podestá, which was a parody, that Cocoliche, of the Italian stagehand, who could not be an actor, it was a stagehand. And I think this is meaningful, I think, of the real condition. But still, it was so, from a marginal point, it was a stagehand. It gives the name to the character, to the language spoken by the foreigner communities. And then we have an institutional story of opera, which we all know this is something different. And I quit.
Instead, adding to this before it goes to Julia, basically, just to mention one case of someone who did travel to Argentina, apart from my family and my father being born there, but this is too private. Instead, not private, an intellectual traveling there in 1922. It's Carlo Emilio Gadda. So someone from a well-off Milanese family decides to go to, very unusual for his character. He was so attached to his home, to his family, and so on and so forth. He decides to travel to Argentina to work for a company in Resistencia. And he spent a couple of years there. He did join the fascist party while he was out in Argentina, and he did write quite a lot about both during the time he was there, but also afterwards. Cognizione del dolore, acquainted with grief, which is one of his major novels, is this pastiche of also languages, but including, the Spanish. And basically, what he does produce is a world that does not exist, an imaginary Italy in Argentina. This is written in the 1930s, but he had lived there briefly for a couple of years, he did join the flow of people living from Genoa. And he does, in Castello di Udine, he does describe quite extensively this living of, from Genoa, describing the distancing, the growing distance between the homeland, finally, and, the experience in the New World. It makes interesting reading. There is quite a lot in his work on this experience.
I'm really nervous because I want to say something personal. But it's according to performing oneself, being an immigrant and try to escape the projection of one's nation. 2 months ago, I've met an Italian guy, and he lives in Poland, in Krakow, for almost 13 years. And he's an artist. He does ceramics, and his own workshop. And we've started an affair, and it's great. But we have only problem because he's a really busy man, and he works a lot. And 2 weeks ago, we've got this conversation about he's working all the time and not able to say no to his student wants to work on the workshops, on his studio. And during your speeches, I was thinking that he makes so much effort to produce the new image of an Italian guy who is working a lot. He's responsible, and that someone can rely on him. And the thing is what I can do, or what
How can you save him?
Exactly, so he don't feel obliged to act like he want to escape this Italian image. I'm also projecting on him probably somehow.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. So maybe he escaped his country. He doesn't want to return Italy because he wants to be perceived in a different way, but somehow he can't do what he does. So it's some kind of a tragedy when you escape your country, and somehow you cannot escape your identity.
Yeah.
So it's a big question if it's possible.
Yeah, I'll give you two quick replies. One is that I'm a workaholic myself, and your story invites me to rethink about the workaholism because it might have these roots as well. I did want to leave Italy very early on, and I left it age 23, so fairly early in my life. Just finished, my degree, went to stay, not just went to visit. So that was one. And Scotland has been my home since. So that's the first story. I may be not the one who has got to address this question because I suffer from the same syndrome. But another one instead may be more interesting within the same anecdotal kind of response. I don't know if you know the international renowned Italian violinist Nicola Benedetti. She is Italo-Scottish and basically born 1987, very privileged kid of a very, interesting family because her father, Giovanni Benedetti, was sent, I think, age 8 or 9, from his family to Glasgow to work directly in a shop, fish and chip shop. He was, like most kids in his, let's say, generation and environment, put on a fish box so as to reach the height of the counter so that they could sell fish and chips, because they were so small they couldn't fit, the kind of adult environment. And hence, Joe Benedetti skipped his education entirely. But, and this may be the savior, of this story, he made later on in life so much money by doing what? By inventing bucco foil. And you can imagine having come from a frying environment in which day in, day out, you're covered in grease. It's a very unpleasant business to fry fish the whole day, fish and chips. And basically, he invented bucco foil, which is, this material that you use to basically bake in a clean way in the oven. You just surround your roast with this plastic that allows you to do a clean job. He has made millions. And this is why Nicola Benedetti, lucky as she was as a kid, she could go, to Guildhall School of Music and so on and so forth, because the father had made enough money in the brief time in which he set up his own shop, which was not to continue in the business of the family, but to move on. And Italians have got that aspiration to move on, societally be movable, kind of mobile. And that is maybe a story of, I don't want to say rehabilitation, but making most of this driver, which is workaholism, because you come from a country where you were classed as not just inferior, but lazy and underproductive. I don't know if it answered that, but good luck in your love.
Thank you. I'm going to conclude this session, remembering the words that have been disseminated during this panel: memory, trauma, removal, archive, and I add historical subalternity. That I think is quite fitting what we said. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chiudiamo.
Should we start, Mateo? Well, so welcome everyone to the last session of this conference. We are reaching the end. The session is called Masters and Migrations. There's been some minor changes, so we have to introduce the session. It's going to be Piotr Horbatowski, whom I invite to the table. He's going to be the first one, because there's Katarzyna Wojciak-Szukur who didn't come, so the next one's going to be Silvia Garzarella. But we'll start by Piotr by now, whom I'm going to introduce. Piotr Horbatowski, if I pronounced well, I hope,
Very well.
is a researcher and teaching professor at the Faculty of Polish Studies at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, where he teaches Polish language and culture to foreigners. His research interests are Polish theater in exile with a special focus on Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. His main publications on the topic are Theatrical Life in Lviv in the years 1939 to 1946, Polish Theatrical Life in Kiev between 1905 and 1918 in the light of documents found in Kiev and Warsaw archives, and the Kiev stage of the artistic activities of Julius Osterwa, and the book Polish Theatrical Life in Kiev from 1905 to 1918. He was recently a visiting professor at Hankook University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, South Korea, and Guangdong University of Foreign Studies in Guangzhou in China. So, Piotr, you have like 25 minutes.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thanks for invitation. It's honored to be here in this great conference and listen to this very, very interesting presentation of my colleagues. And also congratulations for students for yesterday performances. It was great. It was so interesting, and I really enjoy. Congratulations for Professor Pietro, yes, who worked with students. I was really impressed of this. And today I would like to talk about special forms of migrants theater. Very special situation of people who became migrants in their own country because of the war, because of cruel regime, because of change of borders. I would like to talk about Lviv during the Second World War. And I would like to start about pre-war Lviv. Lviv before 1939 was one of the biggest culture, scientific, and economic center in pre-war Poland. There lived around 350,000 inhabitants, including 56% of Poles, 32% of Jews, and 11% of Ukrainians. Lviv was also known as a quite strong center of Polish theater, with a very good drama theater successfully competing with theaters in Warsaw and Krakow, where were located leading theater company. Inhabitants could also enjoy opera company, and many, many music theaters, varietés, cabarets created very special, magical atmosphere of the city. You could see here two of the most important buildings, Opera House and Skarbek Theater. The 21st of September 1939, German Nazi army were just in front of the city, defended by Polish army. At that day, in order to Soviet-German pact, Germans retreated, giving the place for occupation Soviet Russia. After 1 month, 26th of October, Supreme Assembly of Soviet Russia decided that Lviv and other occupied by Soviet army territories of Poland became part of Russia. Talking about Polish theater in Lviv during the Second World War, we should take into consideration a very special situation of inhabitants of the city who became immigrants in their own country. Change of borders resulted that during one day, their rights, sense of security, position rapidly has fallen. According to Soviet plans, the case of the presence of the Polish population in Lviv should be solved until 1943. Authorities of Soviet Russia planned to deport most of the Poles deep into Russia and others sent to the prison. From 1939 to 1941, when city was taken by German, Soviet organized 3 huge deportation waves. Since December 1939, Lviv had been living in constant fear of night arrest by the KGB. Entire families, sometimes people from entire buildings, were deported. There were no trials. People go straight from their cells to wagons and go to Siberia or other Asian regions of Russia. The Soviet regime Soviet regime introduced a completely different system of repression against Poles than fascist Germany. The general objective was almost the same: the elimination of the Polish population or use Poles for typical manual labor. The Soviets, however, kept up appearances. They allowed Polish theaters to play. Polish newspapers were published. Polish school functioned. A pretense of normal life was created behind which repression were hidden. The freedom of actors, writers, of journalists was also apparent. All of them should have created the so-called Polish proletarian culture, Polish Soviet culture. Even the word Polish was often omitted from the name. The Polish Soviet theater was faced with very specific task by authorities. First of all, theater should be a tube of communist propaganda. It was also hoped that the presented repertoire would become a vehicle of increased production of working people. The ideological meaning of the plays should be in turn a weapon against the old bourgeois capitalist system, a tool for discrediting pre-1939 Poland. It was obvious that such a theater was going against the Polish raison d'etat. It falsified the fundamental principles of Polish history and culture. It was particularly inappropriate in the context of the Soviet occupation and the repression of the Polish population. Soviet propaganda needed the theater to achieve its own propaganda goals. For this reason, theater people, actors, directors, technicians, etc., enjoyed special privileges. They could feel relatively safe. One example: the director of Polish Varieté Theater, Felix Konarski, lived in a multi-family house. KGB came one day to arrest and send later to deep into of Russia all inhabitants, around 50 people. When they knocked on Konarski's doors and he replied that he was an actor working in a Polish theater, the KGB officers apologized and left. Throughout the Soviet occupation in Lviv, no one for workers of Polish theater were arrested or deported. Let us, however, remember that it was only about the relative safety of the artist. The Soviets already had experience in dealing with Polish immigrants' theaters. This was the case in Kiev after the Communist Revolution of 1918. When they needed a Polish theater for propaganda purposes, they put a lot of efforts into its establishment and development. With the change of the situation and the internal policy of Soviet Russia in the years 1932-1936, regime began arrested actors, and in 1936-1938, most of them were accused of treason and sentenced to death. Bearing in mind that Soviets planned the final solution to the problem of the Polish inhabitants of Lviv by 1943, it can be assumed that then the Polish theaters would no longer be needed by the authorities. The regime could have done with the artists in Lviv exactly what it had done in Kiev before. The relative sense of security of the artists did not mean, however, that the KGB did not urge them to cooperate. The Lviv actors recalled that they were under pressure to cooperate with the regime. There is no conclusive evidence, but probably 2 employees of the Polish Dramatic Theatre succumbed to this pressure. They played a very negative role in the provocation that led to the arrest and imprisonment of well-known Polish writers living in Lviv. Władysław Daszewski, a stage designer of this for Polish Drama Theatre, and Greta Oranowska, an actress, invited some Polish writers to a restaurant in Lviv, and then she provoked a fight with KGB officer. By a strange coincidence, the police were already waiting outside the door, arresting the writers as provocateurs of beating up a KGB officer. Most likely, Daszewski and Oronowska arranged the meeting and the fight on behalf of the KGB. The Soviet cultural authorities in Lviv ordered a new division of theater buildings. It reflected the nationality policy of the Soviet authorities, giving priority to Ukrainian theaters. They received 2 most prestigious buildings, the Opera Theatre and Skarbek Theatre. We can see here Skarbek Theatre. The decision was purely political, as the Ukrainian Opera House in Lviv never functioned. The strongest and most numerous ensemble, the Polish Dramatic Theatre, was located in a small, badly equipped and not renovated theatre on Jagiellońska Street, and we can see also Jagiellońska Street. I don't have a picture of this theatre. The Soviet authorities did not allow all Polish companies operating before the war to participate in the theatrical life of the city. They limited the number to 1 drama theater, 1 revue theater, and 3 jazz theaters. The Polish Drama Theatre in Lviv had a very long tradition. It was an artistically strong team in which eminent artists worked before the war. For example, Leon Schiller, an outstanding director and reformer of Polish theatre. The Soviet authorities assigned 2 Russian directors to the team, which showed a lack of trust in Poles. Both of them had nothing to do with cultural activities before. The literary director was Wanda Wasilewska, a leading Polish communist, very actively involved in the structures of the Soviet Communist Party. She was also a writer herself. A great lover of her novels and dramas was Stalin. The artists of the theater did not identify themselves with the Soviet regime at all and wanted to pursue a program independent of propaganda. However, as Alexander Bardini claimed, in 1939, a young actors of this theater, after the war, one of the leading artists in Poland, the company had no influence on the decisions made. Comparing the situation to a football match, he stated that the success was to kick the ball out of the field. The authorities were very keen that the repertoire should be dominated by new Soviet dramatic plays fulfilling the goals of Soviet propaganda. They also hoped that Polish writers would write new propaganda dramas in which they would describe the contemporary reality of the Soviet state or criticize pre-war capitalist Poland. However, Soviet propaganda failed. The theater presented 15 premieres, of which only 4 belonged to so-called Soviet revolutionary classics. No one of them criticized Poland. 2 plays were world classic, 1 premiere was based on French boulevard comedy, and 8 premieres were Polish dramas. The repertoire was therefore not dominated by Soviet plays. The main effort of Polish artists at the time was aimed at ensuring that anti-Polish plays were not included in the repertoire. This failed in 1 case. It was a drama written especially for this theater by its literary director, Wanda Wasilewska. In the play about Bartosz Głowacki, a soldier of Tadeusz Kościuszko army, heroically fighting for Poland independence at the end of the 18th century. She presented the history of Poland and its heroes in a very biased way. The protest of the actors who did not want to play the drama did not bring any results. The second Polish theater that received the consent of the Soviet authorities for performances was the miniature theater, the so-called theater of small forms. It was one of many review theaters that pre-war Lviv was famous for. It always attracted large audience, and the Soviet authorities hoped it would also attract them to the propaganda repertoire. Very famous artists performed in this theater, including movie stars such as Eugeniusz Bodo. The artistic director was also a great actor and songwriter, Konrad Tom. According to Soviet plans, the theater was not only to perform in Lviv, but also to tour the USSR and be a spokesman for Soviet propaganda there. In total, the team traveled over 15 kilometers, visiting, among others, Kharkiv, Kiev, Yerevan, Grozny, Baku, Murmansk, Moscow, Leningrad, etc., etc. Also, in the case of the miniature theater, the hopes of authorities for a Polish theater of true propaganda influencing the audience did not come true. Contrary to the demands of the authorities, the group basically continued the earlier artistic program from before the war. Only single political jokes appeared in the programs, but they were also most often ironic toward the communists. Artists allowed themselves much greater freedom during their artistic journey. Soviet censorship was less stringent there. In Russia, it was said about it, God high, Tsar far away. Although the theater was always accompanied by a special official who controlled the theater, the artist managed to make friends with him, drinking a lot of vodka together. So during performances, he was either so drunk that he went to sleep, or he pretended not to understand what they were saying on stage and wrote reports that everything was according to plan. The authorities were really disappointed with the theater activities. They even threatened the management with consequences if the artists did not stop the bourgeois degenerate entertainment. 3 tea-jazz bands completed the picture of Polish professional theatrical life in occupied Lviv. Tea-jazz does not come from the word tea, but theatrical jazz. In this genre, the leading role was played by jazz music. Lviv went crazy for this species. Also, in this case, the authorities' hopes for the propaganda dimension of theatrical jazz did not come true. 3 great Polish bands presented entertainment as far from propaganda as possible. Although, what they said, Polish theaters tried to stay as far away from Soviet propaganda as possible, the question remains whether they should play at all in the situation of Poland being occupied by Soviet Russia. Should they participate in official artistic life, legitimizing the regime? The mere participation in the plans of the Soviet anti-Polish propaganda can be considered as acting against the Polish raison d'etat. The discussion on this topic in Poland began only after 1989, after the fall of the communism and the political transformation. Opinions varied, from accusing artists of collaboration and treason to recognizing their determination to fight for a propaganda-free culture. My conversation with the actors of Lviv theaters showed that they had no such dilemmas. They did not feel that they were acting against the Polish raison d'etat. They knew that they had to work or they would be arrested. They tried to be as loyal to their homeland as possible. They tried to play the Polish repertoire, not the Soviet one. However, they were aware that some 5% depended on them. The rest was decided by Soviet officials. They also pointed out that the authorities of Polish Actors Association did not ban playing in the areas occupied by the Soviets. Such an order applied to the authorities' territories occupied by Nazi Germany. When discussing the activities of theaters, one more circumstance is important. During this dramatic time, theaters provided shelter for those who were in danger of being arrested, secretly from the authorities. People working against the regime were employed in theaters. They had quite often nothing to do with artistic activity, but the necessary documents were falsified. Taking advantage of the regime's more liberal approach to theaters, these people were safer. An example is Irena Anders, the wife of the outstanding Polish general Władysław Anders, who was arrested in 1939 by the KGB. She was also threatened with arrest. She was employed in one of the TJS theaters under the maiden name of Bogdańska, and so she escaped reprisals. On June 22nd, 1941, the war between Nazi Germany and Soviet began. After a week, the Germans took power in Lviv. As in other areas of occupied Poland, the Germans were primarily interested in the complete liquidation of Polish cultural heritage. The official Polish theatrical life in Lviv completely disappeared. At that time, however, we encountered various forms of underground activity. Several of them had the greatest impact. I'm afraid that I have not enough time, so I would just mention youth theater in Sondalicka Mariańska, religious patriotic character of amateur groups, amateur puppet show in Lviv Botanical Garden, around 50 performances, and also probably the most dramatic artistic events in concentration camps. It was uncomplicated poetry and cabaret programs as well as song evenings. In July 1944, Lviv was again under Soviet occupation. The political situation, however, was completely different. Officially, Soviet Russia was part of the anti-Hitler coalition. If until 1941, the Soviets emphasized hostility towards Poland, now, at least theoretically, they were her allies. Theoretically, because the Soviet authorities were already planning to create a communist state dependent on Russia from the future liberated Poland. For this purpose, they established a Polish communist government in the USSR, which was then to be sent to Polish lands. Soviet Russia did not intend to return to Poland the lands Russia occupied after 1939. So the idea of deporting Poles from Lviv came back. Now, however, this action was called repatriation, and Poles were sent not deep into Russia, but to the western territories of Poland. The Russians did not stop making arrests. After 1941, a total of about 50,000 people were arrested. After re-entering the city, the Soviets automatically allowed the resumption of activity of two previously operating theater companies, the Drama Theater and the Miniature Theater. This time, they even allowed the Polish management to manage the theaters. There was also no emphasis on the Soviet repertoire. Even Polish classics were allowed, which after 1939 could not be presented at all. Why? Because the Russians were well aware that Polish theater operated in Lviv only temporarily. Polish theaters was also planned to be evicted from the city in order to completely solve the problem of Poland and its culture in Lviv. At that time, Soviet authorities, in full agreement with the Polish communists, cared only for one thing, that the Polish culture presented in the Polish theater should be subjected to a class and ideological reinterpretation. Those great Polish playwrights and poets, including those from 16th, 18th, or 19th century, such as Kochanowski, Mickiewicz, Wyspiański, were presented as the pioneers of the communist movement, fighting for the revolutionary aspiration of the working class. Both Polish theaters in Lviv used greater freedom, and there were no clear propaganda accents in them. In the drama theater was prepared 10 premieres, 5 plays of Polish classics, 3 foreign comedies, and only 1 contemporary Soviet play. The premiere of The Wedding, Wesele, by Stanisław Wyspiański, had exceptional importance. This play is extremely important for Polish literature, carrying a patriotic message. And although the propaganda, including the Polish communists in Lviv, they presented Wyspiański and Wedding as, again, pioneer of communists. The audience perceived the performance in a completely different way, as a performance about hopes for true freedom and national transgressions leading to the loss of independence. In 1945, 1946, Polish theaters left Lwów. They shared the fate of other Lviv residents. Unfortunately, for many of people living Lwów, artists living Lwów, what happened next was not very happy end. Living in communist Poland did not mean freedom, but for a lot of them, it was against to be an immigrant in their own country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Piotr, for this interesting insight into a case study where people become migrants in their own country, which is, well, dramatic. I guess we'll discuss later. And now I'm gonna call on stage Silvia Garzarella. I'm gonna present her. Silvia is a PhD candidate in visual, performing, and media arts at the University of Bologna. She's currently working on Rudolf Nuriv's Intangible Heritage case study for the project Improving the Fruition of the Intangible Assets of Dance Through Digital Archives and Visual Reality Products. Since 1922, she's member of the editorial board of the academic journal Danza e Ricerca, Laboratorio di Studi, Scritture, Visioni. Her research interests are enhancing archives materials and preserving dance repertoire. Thank you, Silvia.
Good morning, everyone. I'm particularly honored to be here today, and I thank Professor Diego Santos for his introduction, but also because his origin from the University of Madrid actually gives me a good starting point for my presentation, dedicated to the dancer and choreographer Rudolf Nureyev, case study for a wider reflection on the migration of dance styles and dancers, a century-old phenomenon with roots already in the classical age. It was from the city of Cadiz in Andalusia that came probably the first famous ballerinas in history, the Gaditane, sung in a pretty malicious epigram of the Roman poet Martial that I'm not gonna translate, and described by Pliny the Younger, yeah, the Italian probably understand why, and described by Pliny the Younger in an epistle to Septicius Clarus. They were hired individually or as a group to entertain the banquets of the Roman elite. And they were renowned for the use of a form of castagnetas, the crusmata baetica, probably similar to those painted in this fresco found at the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii. Even moving forward to time, the situation doesn't change. It was to Paris that in 1664 moved the Italian dancer and master Giovan Battista Lulli, known as Jean-Baptiste Lully, the name he acquired after the French citizenship. A century later was from France, more specifically from the city of Marseille, that moved Marius Petipa, author of the most famous ballets of the Russian tradition, created, by the way, for Italian dancers. Carlotta Brianza, the first Princess Aurora of all time in The Sleeping Beauty, Pierina Legnani, Odette Odile in Petit Pas Swan Lake, Antonietta Dell'Era, the Sugar Plum Fairy in The Nutcracker, and was from the East that came two of the most important choreographer of the 20th century Western ballet, Georges Balanchine, the Georgian Georgi Melitonovich Balanchivadze, whose style is still handed down by the dancer of the New York City Ballet, and Serge Lifar, the Ukrainian Lifar, who will take the reign of the French Opera Ballet Company. The list might go on, but the fact is that when they are not forced by urgencies, artists are attracted by places where their work is most appreciated, centers of power where the fame of their art is flourishing. Rome in the ancient world, Paris in the 17th century, Petersburg in the second half of the 19th century, and the United States a century later. The life of the dancer Rudolf Nureyev, however, put us in front of a different scenario. Born on a Trans-Siberian train while his mother was traveling to Vladivostok. Yes, it looks a lot like a fairy tale, but apparently it's true. He was born on a train wagon. He began studying professionally in 1955 at the prestigious Vaganova Ballet School, where he graduated in 1958. In the same year, he joined the company of Kirov, now Mariinsky Ballet, where he immediately held roles as principal dancers, becoming within 3 years one of the best-known artists of the Soviet Union. Between the 50s and the 60s, the Soviet ballet company of Kirov and Bolshoi theaters were probably the best in the world. They collected great success abroad, where they often went to raise the grandeur of the so-called Soviet style. Nureyev was also sent abroad. In 1959, he was allowed to dance at the International Youth Festival in Vienna, but his divesque attitude made him an unreliable candidate for future tourneys. It seems that he interrupted the performance of Don Quixote just because he was unhappy with a bulky costume. Nevertheless, in 1961, he was with the Kirov company on a triumphant Parisian date, after which, at the airport of Le Bourget, he asked for political asylum. He returned to Russia only in 1982, more than 20 years later. While Nureyev was escaping the communist regime, the dance world was experiencing a great vivacity. Martha Graham modern dance, Merce Cunningham innovation, the rise of Maurice Béjart. Even ballet was experiencing a moment of liveliness in those years. The Danish dancer Erik Brun opened to a new male protagonism, and in the US, the New York City Ballet Company successfully proposed a brand new short performances without narrative structures. Even in the USSR, the echo of this innovation arrived, but the pressure of the communist regime impeded any push for renewal. As a creative dancer, rebellious, curious, and innovative, Nureyev had no choices. According to the Italian critic Mario Pasi, I quote, he had to leave or fail if he remained in his country. The Kirov, as it was, could not afford a star. Nureyev doesn't have a strong political conscience. His escape was not a desertion from the regime, but anyway, he earned an arrest warrant that puts the KGB minders on his heels until the Gorbachev era. I'd like to show you an unpublished document, his refugee passport. I'm sorry for the resolution, but all the rights of this image belongs to the private collection of Luigi Pignotti, Rudolf Nureyev manager, that I had the pleasure to meet this year, and that gave me access to this collection. The date on the document is 1978. Nureyev will be stateless until 1982, when he obtained the Austrian citizenship chosen in honor of his first performance abroad in Vienna, the one with the bulky costume. The interesting fact is that this legal status is also reflected in his artistic activity. Nureyev will be an eternal guest artist, and this condition will allow him to attend the greatest ballet companies of the time without being bogged down to any of this. In 1961, he signed his first contract with the International Ballet of the Marquis de Cuevas. In 1962, he danced with the English Royal Ballet. In the 64, he worked with the Wiener Staatsoper, 68 with Royal Danish Ballet, and was on the early 70s that he worked with La Scala in Milan and the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City. In 1983, he was the artistic director of the ballet company of the Opéra de Paris. Nureyev strongly believed in his independence as an artist, and it is not surprising that when he had the opportunity to build a company in 1978, he found Nureyev and Friends in his own image, an international company only composed of guest artists with mixed repertoire and a constantly changing cast. Unlike the other dancers that we previously mentioned, Nureyev wasn't adopted by one particular country. His fame and even his name became something shared. There is a Nureyev for each one of the states who hosted him. He was Nureyev in France, Nureyev in Russia, Nureyev in the United States and in the UK, and Mure in Bologna. This is a page from the Bolognese journal Il Resto del Carlino, a review of his first show in Italy. Anyway, what allowed him to take a path not yet beaten? For the media of the time, the migrant attributes of a dancer who used to say the theater is my homeland was the basis for the construction of Nureyev fame. And Nureyev himself took advantage from this narrative. But today we need to overcome this romantic vision and try to look at the phenomenon from an historiographic point of view. Let's take back to his passport. If we look below, we can read a date, 28 July 1951, the day when the Geneva Convention was signed. And probably it's because of this convention that he was able to be stateless for so long and without problems, and so to became different from the dancer that came before him. Another detail, this is the curve of the CO2 emission from the aviation from 1940 to 2010. The years in which Nureyev's career grown, the 60s and the 70s, show a great increase of emission that comes from the many commercial trips landed during the so-called golden age of air travel, starting during the 50s, when the journalist Igor Cassini coined the term jet set, and increased dramatically in the 60s, when big international flight companies such as Pan American were born. Just to get an idea, in 1976, Air France and British Airways were allowed to operate transatlantic routes in a very short time, just 3 hours and 20 minutes for going from London to New York, instead of the 7 hours of the Boeing 747. In my opinion, these facts affected Nureyev's authorial style, not so much investigated by the historiography of dance. Nureyev was a prolific choreographer, famous for his reenactment of the great classics of ballet. Don Quixote, Raimonda, Swan Lake, The Nutcracker, Romeo and Juliet, The Sleeping Beauty, La Bayadère. Known for the technical difficulties, Nureyev's choreography style testifies the different dance experiences that he faced throughout his career. The Russian style, virtuoso and made of great elevation. The finesse of the Bournonville style, studied at Copenhagen with Vera Volkova and learned directly from the dancer Erik Brun. The free expressiveness of modern dance. It was for him that Martha Graham created Lucifer in 1975. Basically, Nureyev embodied what until then had been the personal treasure of the biggest national ballet schools. His choreographic grammar was a portrait of a precise moment in history: mass culture, globalization, new international connections. To realize how he was able to enhance the ballet technique, we are going to look at some of his solos. In the following video, we will see Nureyev in La Sylphide variation, the masterpiece of the Bournonville Danish style. Freshness, musicality, quick footwork, and effortless upper body. So let's see. Yeah, the stuff is brutal. Now, watching at Nureyev version of Don Quixote, revived in 1970 for the Australian ballet with Lucille Aldous. And we will see the same quality of the footwork, used to emphasize the temperament of the Spanish dances that the original Russian version by Petipa entrusted to big character dance scenes. And now the same jumps. Another brutal stuff. Once arrived in the West, one of Nureyev's first wishes was to meet the dancer Erik Brun. Without any rivalry, Brun said just because of the 10-year differences between the two, they suddenly became very close. Nureyev joined him in '62, soon after leaving the De Cuevas company, and learned all the details of the Bournonville technique. In this video, commented by Brun's voice, we can see an extract from their rehearsal where it is possible to recognize some of the footsteps that we have already seen in the previous solo of La Sylphide, like that ballotte with the legs.
We used to do one by either side and each side. We always thought this is not Russian. As it is Russian. And there's something else besides Russian. This is English. It may not be what you like, but it's not necessarily wrong because it's Russian.
Obviously, also the Russian style that Brun mentioned in the video played a fundamental role in the creation of Nureyev's choreographic language. A virtuoso pirouette technique and big jumps characterize all of his works. The illusion of floating is the basis of the Russian style. Temps levés are the final part of each one of the Vaganova technique lesson. Nureyev always wanted to push forward ballet repertoire, even beyond the traditional gender roles. He enhanced the virtuoso element by enriching the male repertoire with footsteps traditionally reserved to the female repertoire. In his pas de deux, both dancers often perform the same elements. Female dancers had to be able to make manège of jumps, and male dancers must perform all the small jumps typical of the 19th century Italian female style. Here we have a part of the coda from the Nutcracker. They are basically doing the same steps. And this is the Nureyev choreography. And now the manège of jumps, something that it's reserved traditionally at the male repertoire. And now look at the bows, perfectly balanced. As a performer, his experience in America with the modern dance allowed him to open his expressive vocabulary. And so the repertoire of the company he directed, such as the Opéra de Paris, that with him faced a tremendous growth. And maybe it was the work with the modern and contemporary dance that allowed him to revive some of the masterpieces of the Ballet Russe, created for classical dancer who at the time struggled a lot to fit in unusual movement. His Après-midi d'Enfant was iconic, as well as his performance in Petrushka. Remarkable was also his ability to adapt the virtuoso technique to the new creation of the contemporary choreographer of his time. I have found an interview about that, where we can see Nureyev talking with the journalist and broadcaster Mavis Nicholson during the rehearsal of Glenn Tetley's Field Figures, staged at the Covent Garden in 1966. It will be the last video, I promise, but I think that can be useful.
To this task of acquiring new vocabulary. Bored. Bored. Gonna do somewhere else. Let it do something else. But satisfaction of doing this very complex choreography, very routine. It's all yours.
As you can see, he was completely comfortable while speaking and dancing in front of a camera. And that is another sign of the mass media culture of his time that he was able to enter and use to build up his fame. As an example, here we have Nureyev in the Muppet Show in 1978, and Nureyev as the main character of Ken Russell movie Valentino. In conclusion, Nureyev was a special kind of migrant, a privileged one. He was already famous when he defected, and the tension of the Cold War made him an international superstar. I think that there is a choreography that have perfectly painted his special condition. It's Maurice Béjar's Song of a Wayfarer, a male pas de deux without traditional gender roles, in contemporary style that immediately became part of the Nureyev and Friends repertoire. The piece is based on Gustav Mahler's cycle of Four Lieder for voice and piano, with lyrics written by Mahler himself. The four movements are dedicated to the idea of the journey, of something constantly on the move. Each lead ends in a different tone from the previous one, and even the choreography of Béjar seems to not give rest to the performers and change constantly. Actually, also Nureyev was a lot of things together. Nostalgia and ambition, pain and majesty. He was an eternal wayfarer, just like the one sung in the Wagner Lieder. And it is from these reasons that I want to end my speech with the verses that close Wagner's Song of a Wayfarer. Verses that, in a way, contain the complexity of the people and the experiences that we have seen in these 2 days, often very different from each other, but all love and sorrow and word and dream. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for this insight into dance, which you hadn't spoken about yet. So now I guess we have some good 20 minutes for discussion. So I'm gonna invite Piotr again on the stage, please. And I guess there will be some questions. Please.
Yeah, thank you. It's a randomic ordering of panel because Piotr has to be another panel, but I think it's interesting because we have made a sort of Soviet panel in some way. So yeah, it was random, but it perfectly fit. I'd like to ask to Silvia, I think because it was really interesting about the deconstruction of a migrant body in certain ways. Rudolf Nureyev mixed a different type of ballet, as I understand, but also a different kind of gender. You said that he embodied female pas de deux. So what about talking about Nureyev as a body of deconstruction in the 20th century? I think it was really a really interesting aspect of your presentation. So if you can add something about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a great suggestion. The point is that Nureyev was basically a dancer. The theoretical aspect of his authorship doesn't exist. So it's hard to interpret his choreography and his work as an author. But I think that a lot of things, we have to do a lot of things and try to reinterpret his vocabulary and understand his vocabulary as a choreographer. Probably it's because of his image of Divo that we didn't have a lot about his work as an author. But I think that, yeah, he did a lot for the ballet repertoire. And maybe right now we are understanding his work.
So thank you, Silvia, for your insight on dance, which is part of the performing arts, which we frequently forget. And I think it's important to remind us that performing arts is made of bodies, and of migrant bodies in that case, although a different kind of body for the migrants we have seen so far. So this is important also to touch base with the concept of superstars as migrants themselves. And that's why I'm so sorry Katarzyna couldn't make it, because Grotowski would have been another excellent case of migrant performer that built basically his career outside, mainly outside of his homeland, to get better and create the myth of his method, of course. But I'd like to get back to Piotr Horbatowski's speech, which starts with a much impressive statement that migrants can also, people can also be a migrant in its own country, in their own countries, which reminds us of the concept we discussed yesterday with Ekin Bodur and Inua Ellam's Antigone's version, when she discusses the topic of the metic as a resident alien, which is the condition that many people suffer today. And speaking of which, speaking of current days, I'd like to, if you'd like to talk more about this relationship between Polish theater moving to Ukraine and what happens when it comes back in the current days. Because this is something that we enlightened yesterday, we started yesterday, but from an more historical perspective. Because yesterday we discussed it, thanks to Agata and Julia, in the current days, in the present days. But it seems to me, because I know very little of your theatrical history, that there's something going on for over a century of exchanges in that area. Thank you.
Talking about present days, it's very interesting. It's what my colleague said yesterday about this scale of support for Ukrainian people in Poland, which is really surprised even for us, especially when we remember very complicated relationships between Poland and Ukraine in the past. So, first of all, I think it's true. I have to agree with that Polish government did a lot of things just as a PR action. Fortunately, they did something, because at the very beginning, it was just people, it was just society, Poles, volunteers who supported Ukraine. Next day after invasion appeared, they collected food, they collected clothes to send to Ukraine. It was volunteers in train station to give support to people who just came to Poland and left bombing territories of Ukraine. And it's quite interesting, because when we ask Ukrainian people about invasion, about the war, all of them have one answer. It didn't start February, 24th of February, 2022. It started in 2014. It was the beginning, which world didn't recognize that it was the beginning of the war. Now it was just invasion. It was just next step made. And it's also interesting that, talking about the relation between Poland and Ukraine, it started to change in 2014, when Polish politicians went into Kiev, into Maidan. I don't know, do you know what is Maidan? The main market square in Kiev. And it was huge protest against Ukrainian, we can call dictator Yanukovych, who collaborated with Russia. And it was also interesting at that time, also Polish theater. My colleagues presented Oksana Cherkashina. She came to Poland at that time, and she found help, support in Polish theaters, yes? At that moment, Polish theaters also organized some kinds of performances to support Ukraine. So theaters is very active, is very sensitive for this kind of support. And the next day after invasion, now I'm talking about 24th of February 2022, next day in front of theaters, we could see in front of most of Polish theater, Ukrainian flag. It was just symbolic support, but after the end of presentation, actors gave support to Ukraine, gave support and protest against the war. It was almost everywhere. They opened space of theaters for immigrants. They could be there if they have enough space. They can stay, not artists, for all people. They collected food, clothes, etc., etc. You should know that Ukrainian theater was completely unknown in Poland, completely unknown. In 2017, Korzeniowska-Bichun, a person who speaks fluently Ukrainian translator, published a book, a new modern Ukrainian drama. And she asked plenty of directors of Polish theaters to present, to prepare these dramas for a stage. Nobody was interested. Nobody. They answer, okay, it's Ukrainian. It's not about Polish reality. Polish audience would be not interested in. It changed at that moment. They started finally to read, and they realized it's quite interesting. It's also about our reality. It's not something strange. So it started with performatic reading of dramas, whole dramas or part of drama. It was also quite interesting because theaters use also messages, information posted on Facebook, and it was just performatic reading of messages. And this was so powerful. Just actors reading messages that people die, that people try to fight, It was just the beginning of this activity of theaters. It was also interesting after bombing this theater in Mariupol. In most of Polish theater, in front of this theater was huge sign, dzieci, children. It was children who was killed in this theater. But then it started to change a little bit. Why? They tried to do something more. And I remember it was the European Day of Theater, 27th of March in Poland. And it was huge manifest written by Polish artists, which the main topic, theater should be a shelter for immigrants, not just Ukrainian, not just Belarus, people from Belarus, also from Arabic country. And they remember, it was interesting because they said, should be a shelter for people from train station, means Ukrainian who visited train station coming from Ukraine, and from forests. Why forest? Because I told you yesterday, yes, it was just group of immigrants who was invited by Belarus. It is political action. They invited these people promising entrance to Europe, and they were stopped by Polish guards, and they were between in the forest. It was colder and colder. These people dying. It was true. A lot of people died. And Polish people, against any human rights and against any convention, didn't allow them to send application, because some of them could be real immigrants. They have everything to stay in Poland. So it was for all immigrants, also for Ukrainian people. And it started very important and action called residential programs. So we call special foundation. It was also sponsored by Theatrical Institute in Warsaw, but also government gave money to residents. So Ukrainian artists who come to Poland, and I think it is, I'm just guessing, 60, 70, maybe more people, they were able to find to be a resident of particular Polish theaters. It was for 6 months, and they have money not just to survive, but also for something much more important, to continue artistic works. We should remember all of these people were in huge trauma. For example, most of this presentation, artistic presentation, started with workshop because these people was not able to do anything. They left families, husbands, because we are talking about migrants. We are talking about women. It's only women because men stay in Ukraine to fight. So they need some time to understand. For example, preparing one of these performances, I told you yesterday, Sześć żeber gniewu. I forgot to check what is żeber, doesn't matter. It was interesting drama by Sasha Denisova. And you know, it was in this performance was drone used. And these people couldn't stand this because they were afraid. Actors was afraid of drone because they have this kind of experience from Ukraine. So it was just the beginning. Because of this program, these people started to present mostly using performatic strategies. They used to prepare performances mostly about war, about invasion. What was quite characteristic, when I first time, I watched a lot of these dramas, but it was interesting. When I first time tried to see this, I was afraid of this kind of, sadness, martyrology, how to deal with this, how to be an audience. And I was so surprised. Of course, it was so tragic because Bucha and many other places where Ukrainian people were killed, rapeness or rape of these people. It was also presented somehow. But it was a lot of humor, ironic humor, and people was completely lost. The audience, what we should do? Like yesterday, you talk about performances, yes? Should we smile? This is tragedy, and they smile. They have so huge distance. It was ironic jokes about Russian, of course, but also about Ukrainian ones. So, and they waiting for this. Actors told me, we are waiting. It should be also funny because it's a war. It's complete. It's everything inside. We want to present how it looks. They don't need compassion. They don't need any mercy. They said, we want to show resistance. This is very characteristic, but also sense of humor. It's the way how we act against the war. This is something which keep Ukrainian society solid and strong. And also it's interesting, it's absolutely different because in Poland folk music, it's old-fashioned. It's like Italian, we can say Polish immigration, yes, folk music and dances, yes, and Krakowiak, yes. For them, it's important and keep this community together. So they use also this Ukrainian folk music. It's interesting. When I talk to actors, they said, we know that it's different in Poland, but for example, after the end of the presentation, when already we are out of the stage, we started to sing folk music because we were happy. And this is characteristic. It was young people, young girl. So it was surprising for me. It was a very interesting presentation, but it was just first step. At the same time, another important thing, what kind of actors? I was curious, what kind of people come to Poland? What kind of artists? And this is also a problem about Ukrainian theater has also a problem because it's very conservative. It's based on long Stanislavski Russian tradition. A lot of the state, rich theater cooperated, not now, with Russian theaters, traditional Russian theaters. So Chekhov is the most important. But Ukrainian people, we should something different. Yes, we need to look for our tradition. They go back to Les Kurbas. I don't know, do you know Les Kurbas? He was a reformer of Ukrainian theater in 20s, 30s, and he was killed by Stalin in 1936. Yes, but it was just tradition which they want to follow. Yes, but it was impossible. I was interested in what kind of artists came to Poland. People, young women, of course, from small private independent theater. We get luck. We were very lucky because we have 4 eminent drama writers: Olena Apchel, Sasha Denisova, Lena Lagushonkova, and Natalia Bloch. And for example, Lena Lagushonkova, he spent last days in Ukraine in a special shelter when Kiev was bombing, finishing her last drama. But when he came to Poland, I talked to her and she said, I try to present my dramas to so many places and all directors refuse because no, it's not interesting, because it was about present day in Ukraine. It was about problems of the Ukraine, also about LGBT, which is of course not acceptable, about alcohol, drug users, but not only. It's about present time in Ukraine. Nobody was interested. Now, couple months ago, Lagushonkova got the European New Talent Award in Stuttgart, which is like European Oscar for drama writers, as one of the best, most prospective young writers. Huh? Not in Ukraine. In Poland, yes. Her dramas is probably 4, even 5 dramas was already presented in Poland and in many different places in Europe, not in Ukraine. Yes, so this kind of actors, Oh, I knew that I forgot this name, Sasha, not Sasha. Doesn't matter. I'm sorry. But another actors, she established theater arabesque. This is the most experimental theater in Ukraine. She is in Poland. So this group of people coming, and when I talked to them, they told me, we came here, of course, sometimes accidentally, because you don't choose, you have no always chance to choose direction during the war where you want to go. But they said, we were lucky, we need to be in Poland because we remember tradition of Grotowski, we remember some people like Sasha Denisova cooperated with Lupa, Christian Lupa, with Warlikowski, Jarzyna, etc. We want to learn as much as we can to continue to bring new ideas to Ukraine. And it's also interesting, I think now it's at the beginning of new period. Why this residential program is important? Because it's not only for today, for present time, to give a chance Ukrainian actors, artists for presentation. It should be also long-term cooperation between Polish theater, Ukrainian theater. They make some kinds of connection. They make connection. After residence ended, they still are able to present in different places, yes? And for example, Sasha Denisova, this very good drama writers, he wants to establish in Poland, then maybe move to Ukraine, maybe in Poland stay theater Nowa Reduta, New Reduta. Why it's so important? Because Reduta, it was theater established in 1919 by great reformer of Polish theater, Juliusz Osterwa. It was kind of laboratory. It was kind of, I don't know, I can compare, but I would just want to compare to a little bit Grotowski theater, yes? Something, a new methods of directory, a new methods of playing by actors, yes? So and why New Reduta is important for Ukraine? Because as you read in 1914, during the First World War, in Kiev was a lot of eminent Polish actors. There exists great Polish theater. Osterwa was there. And we have evidence they met together, Lech Kurbas, the reformer of Ukrainian theater, and Osterwa. They planned to do something together. Finally, Osterwa left and established Reduta. Kurbas was killed. But what is interesting, and New Reduta could continue these ideas for cooperation. So it is perspective for something new, not about all bad relation with Ukraine, sometimes stressed, fortunately before the war by our government. Sorry, I complained my government the last time. But still, it could be something interesting, something new, something good for Polish theater, for Ukrainian theater, for both theaters. We will see what happened. The most important, the end of the war. For Ukrainian people, the end of the war, it's not some kinds of compromise. It should be final victory. So all territory should be left to Ukraine. That's how they dream, yes? That's like generally, not saying more details. Don't have time.
Very much. I think we all appreciate, because to link historical matters with current matters. So I don't know. We still have some time. So any further question? Yes.
Ok, no. Thank you so much for the intervention and very interesting topics that you discuss. I have like, it's not a question, it's like a sharing of information with Silvia Gazzarella about, I was thinking about the terms that you used about the reenactment of the techniques. I was thinking about the reconstruction also because it's very interesting how the body of a dancer that becomes a migrant and becomes a traveler, this body takes with this body you take certain types of values and meaning with yourself. And it's very interesting how the technique that we think is national or identitarian is not identitarian at all. Because, for example, he we know Nureyev because he spreaded the Russian technique in all Europe is not true, because the Russian techniques comes from an Italian.
And France.
That is France and Italian. It's like Enrico Cecchetti was in St. Petersburg in the beginning of the 20s. But it's very interesting for me how it's not possible to think about a dance technique as an identitarian topic of a country. Also because, for example, the Cecchetti technique, the Italian one, is there is one school, I think, in Italy that teach the Italian technique. There is no school that teach. There's probably one in Firenze. And it was adopted by British people. So if you go to Royal Ballet, you learn to dance like an Italian teacher. And if you go to Balanchine, that learn from Cecchetti technique. So the most modern technique that you have in America is an Italian technique, because he learned from Cecchetti directly. So, and the other thing that I want to ask you about your research on the Nureyev path is, how do you think that all his career and his path in his life, from a biographical point of view, is a very interesting way of reading the repertoire in a political way, because he came back in Russia in 1987, and I think that his activity as a choreographer was it's really difficult for me to explain this, sorry. His activity as a choreographer was an attempt, sometimes it worked, sometimes it doesn't work at all, to rewrite the Russian repertoire with another type of point of view, staying with the tradition, because it doesn't touch it. It did not make a reenactment, actually. It did a reconstruction, or with the point of view, mixing all the techniques that he faced in all the career. I don't know if you think about that, but I think it's actually that.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. He always was so proud to be Russian in a way, and of the Russian style. I think when I think about choreography, I intend the choreography as a grammar. So probably, yes, he was Russian inside. The grammar came from Russia, but he sort of mixed a lot. So even the Russian technique that Nureyev absorbed was filled with the Danish style, the French style. And it's curious that I talked a lot with dancer from the Opéra de Paris, and for them Nureyev was their further, the French style nowadays, it's a lot like Nureyev style. It's weird because Nureyev style is completely mixed. So yeah, the language of the ballet, it's really mixed and compromised, and it's hard to understand. Also, the national ballet schools are not so national. And it's another question that I have regarding to language, if I can. It's for Piotr, and I was wondering what was the role of the language in the Soviet Polish theater back to the time, but also nowadays, the language of the oppressor, for example. So also as a teacher.
Talking about the Second World War, Polish theater should present all presentation in Polish. So they didn't want to change the language of presentation into Polish. Yes, that's what you asked me about, or no?
Yeah.
Talking about Ukraine, now it's interesting because most of this presentation was in Ukrainian with Polish subtitles. Sometimes it was partly Ukrainian, partly Polish, because it was also mixed, presented by Polish and Ukrainian actors. Polish and Ukrainian is not the same. For people without experience, it's not easy to understand, but it's quite common. So I know that for Ukrainian actors, it takes not so long to speak Polish. And for example, talking about this residential program, yesterday we talked about it. Already Oksana Cherkashina was the first Ukrainian actors who got permanent job in Polish theater, but now during residential program, 2 other actors, Ukrainian actors, got a permanent job in Silesian theater. So they didn't speak Polish at that time. Okay, they were able to speak, but with accent, they didn't know Polish very well. But after a couple of months, when I watched them, they were able to exist. So this language program, especially language barrier, is not something which could stop these people. So they are able to existing in Polish group, talking with Polish people, to present programs in Polish. You should also remember, for example, one of the very active person, Helena Ryba. She still is a director of small private independent theater in Lviv. She speaks Polish fluently because, Lviv, it's a place with Polish tradition, and a lot of Ukrainian people also visiting Polish show. She's Ukrainian, 100% Ukrainian, but she already speaks Polish. So she used Polish language during the presentation. So it's easy to deal with this situation, with this language problem. And talking about oppression, I know, and it was in the past, before the war, before 2014, when I visited Lviv, all people recommend me, don't speak Russian. I speak Russian. I understand Ukrainian. Speak Polish. It shouldn't be a problem with Polish. So even because of this difficult relation, Polish was much better than Russian in Lviv. In Kiev was different. I can use Russian because it's far away from Poland. They didn't know Polish, but Russian was okay. Now, of course, it changed. Now most people speak Ukrainian, and it's better use English instead of Russian.
I want to come back to Osterwa and Kurbas, who Piotr mentioned. and it's like more a general question probably to all of you, because like the cooperation of Osterva and Kurbas wasn't possible at that time, and probably, like, as I imagine, it's the matter of their characters and the ego, and the status of the artists, and the way the artists perceive themselves as, like, especially in Poland, like demiurgs and gods, and they are just like, they believe in their vision and don't want to compromise about it. And this is what makes cooperations so difficult. So, like, my question is, can you give any positive examples about this kind of cooperations between the artists of two nations, like the immigrants, who are able to create a new method, a new language, and so on. So it's like, yeah.
I know that you don't ask me. I just about Kurbas and Osterva. It's interesting because even this meeting of Kurbas and Osterva is problematic. Korzeniowska Bichun told that, this is like information, not proof. Information. Maybe they met. Maybe they didn't met, maybe they want to cooperate, maybe they don't want to cooperate. But talking about Nova Reduta and New Reduta and the idea of Sasha Denisova, she got this information about Kurbas. She know about this hypothetical cooperation. So the idea of Reduta, it's like to come back. We are not sure it was real meeting, yes, but the idea still exists, yes, and it was returned to combine something from Kurbas, from Osterva. But first of all, this is idea of cooperation of new, experimental, interesting, present theaters, Polish theaters and Ukrainian theaters.
Any other answer to our colleague's question?
I mean, this operation, which you criticize in an historical way, it's my opinion, perfectly matches some of the topics we discussed previously, prior to this presentation. That is to say, the creation of the imaginary of the migrant and of nationality, as outlined correctly, in my opinion, and the invention of nation nowadays, that also Diego outlined, is a creation, is a cultural creation. And so we have to keep in mind that it's always somehow fictional, it's not real. And I think we can take something good from that proposal, which is to say, to find a cooperation, even reinventing the past. Because in an historical way, I agree, it's unacceptable, it's fictional. But if it may be a viable tool for creating cooperation today, as historians, we must say it's not real. But as spectators, I think we should accept it in a way. So I think the best policy is always compromise, in my opinion. It comes from the diplomatic institute. Thank you, Diego. Like
well, so I guess we can close the session now.
Okay.
I'm going to ask for an applause for our participants, but also to the warmest applause for the organizers. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. And as a conclusion, but just a quick thank to all the speakers who joined this conference and this research project, which was granted by the Europe Alliance, and this is the final conference of the project, but I think it might hopefully serve as an open end for future development with our very much expected and deserved. So I hope that we might be granting in some other ways. We will look for that in the next future, I guess. That's our mission starting tomorrow, I guess, or Monday, much better. So besides thanking the Europe Alliance for granting us the seed funding opportunity to produce this conference, I would also like to ask my colleague Rossella Mazzaia, who coordinated the session with Cantieri Metic, the three movements we had the chance to experience yesterday, and also the companies, Cantieri Metic and Migrantheatre, who not only performed here during the session, but also accepted to share their experience, as though somehow controversial ones, but that's what makes the conference fruitful and give some debate. I also like to thank Emanuele Reggi, who chaired the first session this morning, but also supported me in the organization of the conference, and Articultura and the technicians and Valentina Ferretti for supporting with their work and my shifting and changing requests over time that were always fantastic, fabulously fulfilled. And as I said, I hope this might be the first step of a much longer path. So thank you all.